Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. A Christmas Cabin Built for Two by Emma Ashwood. Prologue. Eve gently stirred from her deep slumber. Even before she opened her eyes, she became aware of many sounds. First, numerous church bells rang. Some were close, others more distant, and the sound was almost joyful, as if celebrating a great event. Second, the far more familiar sound of her papa shoveling coal into the kitchen stove. Her eyes slowly opened, and she glanced toward the small window in her bedroom. It was completely covered in ice. She stared at the intricate patterns for a moment, marveling at nature's wonders. Then suddenly she realized that it was finally here. It was what she had been waiting on for what seemed to be an eternity. She sat up in bed excitedly, ignoring the freezing cold blast as she pulled back the blankets. It was Christmas Day. She looked to the end of her bed and saw the green stocking she hung up the previous evening. Last night it was empty. Now it bulged enticingly. Reaching out, she grabbed it eagerly. Inside, to her delight, was with every type of candy she could imagine. Santa Claus had arrived overnight, just as her mama and papa said he would. She had, after all, been a very good girl this year. She popped a piece of orange-colored candy into her mouth, savoring the sweet, sugary taste as it began to dissolve. A moment later, it exploded in her mouth with a fizzy, popping sensation that made her giggle. Quickly, she dressed. It was far too cold to linger in her nightdress. This winter had been particularly harsh. The Lower East Side lay under a thick blanket of snow this Christmas morning, as it had done for the previous 2 weeks. Her beloved papa worked as a clerk for a bank in the middle of Manhattan, so they were fortunate to live in one of the best tenement buildings in the area. Unlike some of the slum tenements a few blocks away, their building was well maintained, and they enjoyed 4 reasonably spacious rooms all to themselves. When she walked into the kitchen, she was immediately greeted by her parents. "Happy Christmas, darling," her mama said, enveloping her in a warm embrace. Her mother was beautiful, with flowing red hair just like hers. "Happy Christmas, Mama," she replied gently. "Happy Christmas, my beautiful princess," her papa declared, hugging her close and making her feel warm and secure. Her father told her she was beautiful at least once every day without fail. The morning chill that lingered in the other rooms had left the kitchen as the stove roared to life. Mama opened it and quickly slid in the cinnamon rolls she had just prepared. "There'll be a delicious Christmas morning treat," she said with a smile, looking at her daughter's eager face. "Why don't we go into the sitting room while these are baking?" Mama suggested, taking Eve by the hand. Her mother's fingers were red and pricked with needle marks. She often took on work mending clothes to earn a few extra dollars for the family. Eve stroked them softly, as if trying to heal them. Eve gasped as her papa opened the sitting room door. A Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, its branches adorned with small candles and beautifully crafted paper decorations. Her father had brought it into the tenement the previous evening after Eve had gone to bed, so it would be a surprise. "It's beautiful," the little girl declared, dropping her mother's hand for a moment and dancing in delight on the spot. "Santa Claus left me some candy at the end of my bed," Eve said excitedly. "Well, it seems he might have left you something else under that tree. You'd better go and look," Papa said in his deep voice. Underneath the tree were several packages, all wrapped carefully in brown paper and string. Eve ran over and knelt by the tree. She picked up the smallest package first and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pair of beautiful red mittens, along with a matching red scarf. "I love them," she exclaimed, slipping the scarf around her neck and pulling the mittens on, so warm and snuggly. Her mother sat down in a chair, watching her daughter with joy shining in her eyes. Everything she did was for this little girl. It was always a pleasure to see her so happy. She had spent an hour every night for the last 2 months knitting this gift for her daughter. Eve opened the next package to find a selection of books. All were secondhand, of course, but that didn't matter to her, and she had no idea. She would spend hours reading them. She flicked through the brightly colored leather covers, reading the titles: Uncle Tom's Cabin, Ruth Hall, The Daisy Chain, and The Water Babies. Some of them may be a little hard for you to read right now, but we can help you learn, her father said with a smile. This is the one we'll read before bed tonight, he added, picking up a green leather-bound book. It's called A Christmas Carol by a gentleman named Charles Dickens from England. Lowering his voice, he continued, It's a Christmas ghost story. But don't worry, it has a happy ending. Eve clapped her hands together in excitement. She loved it when her father read to her, and ghost stories were some of her favorites, as long as they weren't too scary. Finally, there was one more gift. Even wrapped, it hinted at something special. When Eve tore the paper away, it revealed a beautiful doll with flaming red hair. She practically squealed with delight and held it close to her chest. She looks just like me. What will you call her? Her mama asked. Rachel, she said without a moment's hesitation. This is just the greatest Christmas ever, declared Eve, kissing the doll gently on the cheek. Well, I think it's time for breakfast, Mama said with a clap of her hands. She got to her feet and made her way to the kitchen. Nothing made her happier than seeing her daughter so full of joy. After they enjoyed their breakfast of warm cinnamon rolls, they changed into their best clothes and walked the 4 blocks to their church. The bells still rang out across the length and breadth of the city. The family greeted passers-by with jovial "Merry Christmas" wishes as they crossed paths in the streets. It seemed that for one day of the year, everyone was friendly. When they returned, Mama made the final preparations for Christmas dinner while Eve played with Rachel and Papa dozed in front of the fire. Before leaving for church, Mama had slipped a small turkey into the stove. It was stuffed with sausage meat and herbs. Now she worked on preparing mashed potatoes, succulent little carrots, and some parsnips glazed with fresh honey. Within an hour, the meal was ready. As Eve put the first bite of turkey and stuffing into her mouth, she knew this was the most delicious food she'd ever tasted. Afterward, they indulged in the Christmas pudding her mama had made 2 months ago, which had been aging in the corner of the pantry. It was so rich that by the time she finished, Eve was sure she could never eat another bite again. Of course, less than an hour later, she was delving into her green stocking, seeing what candy she could find to eat. Don't make yourself ill, her mama said, giving her an almost playful warning stare. I'll be fine, she replied, grinning mischievously. That afternoon, they played board games. Her papa had taught her chess earlier that year, and for the first time she managed to beat him. He smiled with paternal pride as she made her final move to checkmate his king. You see, he said, not only are you a beautiful princess, but you're clever as well. As the light faded on that special Christmas day, Mama got up and returned to the kitchen to make huge turkey sandwiches with bread she had baked the previous evening. They were filled with turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce. Then they settled down in front of the fire, and Papa began to read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens out loud. Her father had a special voice for each of the characters, which Eve absolutely adored. Finally, as the story came to its close and Tiny Tim said the famous words, "God bless us, everyone," Eve's eyes began to close, still clutching Rachel in her hands. She fell asleep, and her papa gently picked her up and carried her to bed. He tucked the blankets around her chin. She opened her eyes for the briefest moment and said, "This was the best Christmas ever. I want every single one to be just like this." Chapter 1, 14 years later. Eve boarded the train and settled into her seat in the compartment, nervously glancing out the window. It was almost as if she expected her boss to be chasing her along the platform, demanding once more that she show him favor. She knew perfectly well what he meant by that, and she had no intention of obliging. She was fleeing New York for a new life out west. She opened her battered, old green carpet bag and pulled out the final letter from Arthur Hardwick. She read it for what must have been the 400th time. "Your letters and your picture have enchanted me," he wrote in a large, assured script. Then her brilliant blue eyes picked out the key line further down the page. "Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" This was the escape route Eve needed. She had accepted in writing immediately, and now, due to recent events, she was already on the train. Arthur wasn't expecting her just yet. She had used almost every last dollar she owned to purchase the ticket. Arthur had promised to send her money, of course, but there was no time to wait for his reply to her acceptance. She had to leave before the danger of having her honor compromised became a reality. Since her parents' deaths 2 years ago, she had been working in the clothing factory under the supervision of Crispian Black. Crispian was a man around 40 years of age, married and, to the best of her knowledge, with numerous children. But that didn't stop his vile practices within the factory. Any young, attractive woman became his target. In fact, it seemed to be his sole purpose when hiring staff. Many of the women succumbed to him. Crispian was a handsome, charming man who made promises. Many, many promises. Wages would increase, conditions would improve, he would leave his family and start a new life with the woman in question. Of course, very few of these promises came to fruition. Some women might see a few extra cents an hour, or perhaps a slightly more comfortable role, but Crispian never ever left his wife. Eve shuddered to her core. She was a good Christian girl and would never impose upon the sanctity of marriage. She would never consider being with a man unless she was married. But now Crispian had become obsessed with her. It seemed her refusal had driven him mad. He'd find her alone in the storeroom at the factory, his hands pawing at her shoulders and back. She would flee, hearing his mocking laughter. "It will happen, Eve. Just wait and see." As she grew increasingly aware of Crispian's refusal to accept her no, she had picked up a copy of the Matrimonial Times in an attempt to work out a means of escape. She had, of course, looked for other work, but nothing paid as well as this job, and her finances were already tight. She read an article about women who had headed west for a new life. The option seemed perfect. There was nothing but the same misery here in New York. If she did have to leave this job, she would struggle to keep her tenement apartment, and she had no idea what horrors might await her then. Arthur's advertisement appealed to her. He was apparently a businessman in Montana. He'd been married once before, but his wife had unfortunately died, leaving him without children. Now he was eager to start a family. He was older. She was 21 and he was 38, but it was the way of the world where older men often sought younger brides. She hadn't expected him to write back when she started their correspondence. After all, Arthur's advertisement had painted an idyllic picture of a successful businessman of above-average height, slim build, and a pleasing face. He lived and worked on a ranch, but held many business interests in the area. Eve thought that many other women would be writing to him. Even so, Eve knew she was a beautiful woman. Her father had told her so every day of her life while she was growing up. Now she knew it from the admiring glances she drew from men wherever she went. Men would walk beside their wives and their stares would follow her. The men would earn a jab in the ribs from their disgruntled wives, from whom Eve would receive icy stares. She wanted to tell them she had no intention of stealing their husbands. She wasn't that type of woman. Ever since her parents' death, she had been stretching what money she had. She moved to a smaller apartment in a rundown tenement. She feared losing her job because the next step down the housing ladder wasn't worth thinking about. Before sending her first letter to Arthur, she hired a photographer to take her picture. It grieved her to part with the money, but she knew that she must use every advantage at her disposal. Her appearance was her biggest advantage. The photographer produced a pleasing image, and she enclosed it with her letter. A month later, much to her surprise, she received a reply. Arthur regretted that he couldn't send a photograph in return, since there was no photographer in his vicinity. But he described himself as a man of seemingly handsome appearance, leaving her to imagine what he looked like. He pressed her to write again and tell him more about herself. Their correspondence had started in the spring. Now, it was just 2 weeks before Christmas, and already the first snowfall of winter had been and gone. The shops in the expensive areas of the city had been full of Christmas gifts since the start of the month. Children ran around, clearly full of excitement. Eve was exhausted from working longer hours to deal with a recent sharp increase in her rent. It didn't help having to fight off Crispian Black's constant advances. Her life was one constant source of worry. 2 days ago, just before she retired to bed, there was a sharp rap on the door. Over the years, she had learned to be cautious and listen through the door. If it was one of her neighbors, Sally with the 4 children and husband with a bad leg, or the old widow Molly, they would announce themselves. This time it was silence. She recognized the heavy breathing and that strange nasal sniff. She heard it every day in the factory. Somehow, Crispian had found out where she lived. "I know you're in there, Eve. I can make your life so much better if you let me. You need to show me a little kindness." His words slurred slightly, and she knew the man had been drinking. She stood motionless, praying for the man to leave. After knocking a little longer and making more empty promises through the door, he eventually stumbled away down the stairs, but not before saying, "I'll be back." Eve didn't doubt it for a second. Now even her home, such as it was a refuge. This was why, instead of going to the factory that morning, she had packed up her belongings and headed for the Grand Central Depot. Once there, she purchased a ticket to Helena, Montana. Her new life was about to begin, and just in time for Christmas. Chapter 2. Eve saw the first snowfall 2 hours outside of Chicago. By the time they reached the Windy City, most of the passengers on the train were looking out of the windows with concerned faces. The world had turned white. It was here that she had to change trains and then head towards St. Paul in Minnesota. She faced the better part of a 9-hour wait, and all around her, the chatter was about this storm being the worst in a decade. Many of the travelers harbored secret concerns about whether or not the train would make it to its destination in Minnesota. That was only a fleeting thought in her mind. She was just relieved to have escaped New York City and the clutches of Crispian Black. She wondered if, by now, he knew she had disappeared. He would certainly have known she hadn't shown up to work. Perhaps it would have prompted him to visit her home that evening. It was now just over 24 hours since she left New York. When she left her tenement, she locked the door behind her, simply leaving the key in the lock for the landlord to find when he came to collect the rent in 2 days. He would know she'd vacated. She felt a twinge of guilt about not paying the man what was due, but the rent was inflated anyway. She had to do what was best given the situation. She hadn't even said goodbye to her neighbors. She thought it best that nobody back in the city knew where she was headed. That way, Crispian Black would never be able to track her down. She was sure that once she'd been gone a while, his infatuation with her would wane, and his attentions would fully focus on other young women in the factory. A shudder ran down her spine when she thought about it, and a part of her even felt guilty for leaving others exposed to his hideous ways. She wondered whether Black had actually turned the key in the lock himself and walked into the place she once called home. The thought almost made her feel sick. But then she knew she was safe. She was no longer in his clutches. Finally, the train arrived that would take her to St. Paul, and once more, she was fortunate enough to find a carriage to herself. Eve knew perfectly well that a young woman traveling alone might be problematic, so she made sure to greet the guard warmly before boarding each train, ensuring he knew she was traveling alone. She prayed this would offer some form of protection and he would keep a lookout for her. Of course, she hadn't been entirely foolish when she packed her belongings. The one good sharp knife she used for preparing food had also been slipped into her green carpet bag, right on top and at hand if needed. By the time they pulled out of Chicago, the snow had stopped falling. She thought perhaps all the talk at the station about this being the worst storm in years was nothing more than hearsay and gossip. Eve spent the time thinking about how she would spend Christmas with Arthur. No doubt by that time they would already be married. She wondered if Christmas in Montana would be like Christmas with her parents. A roaring fire, with a Christmas tree in the sitting room and gifts waiting on Christmas morning. Would there be turkey for Christmas Day dinner? This was something she yearned for. She wanted that idyllic Christmas she'd enjoyed as a young girl, before her parents got sick. She wanted to experience it first with her husband and, with God's good grace, a family of her own. It took just 14 hours to reach St. Paul, And here, Eve changed trains for the final and longest stretch of her journey to Montana. She hoped that once again she would be lucky enough to have a compartment to herself. And it was in St. Paul that Eve's luck ran out, and she had no idea how significant it would be for her future. Chapter 3. Would you mind if I joined you? Eve asked hesitantly. She had walked up and down the length of the train twice. There wasn't a single empty compartment available. For this, the longest leg of the journey, she would have to travel with others. She couldn't help but feel apprehensive, but she knew she had been lucky up to this point. Several compartments were completely out of the question, being populated solely by young men. They were probably all heading out west to try for their fortunes. It would be highly inappropriate to share a carriage with any of them, even if they all appeared on the surface to be upstanding and gentlemanly. However, her recent experience with her boss back in New York had taught her that appearances could be deceptive, and she couldn't be too careful. She decided her best option was a compartment that appeared to hold an elderly man and his wife. The man had a long white beard with a hat pulled down tightly over his head. He seemed bundled up against the cold in a thick coat, scarf, and gloves. She guessed his age to be somewhere in his 60s, but if he was older, she wouldn't have been surprised. His wife, at least she assumed his wife as she was gently patting his arm as they talked, was a brunette and appeared to be maybe 20 years or more his junior. It was the wife Eve addressed from the platform. "Of course, my dear," she replied warmly. "Come on up. Robert, help her, will you?" The man stood to his feet surprisingly easily, considering what appeared to be his age. He took the carpet bag from her hand and offered a steadying hand as she climbed aboard. He gave a small bow as she stepped into the compartment. "Thank you very much. I appreciate it," Eve said. "The pleasure is all ours, I'm sure," Robert said somewhat formally. "My name is Robert Mortimer. This is my wife, Katie." Eve offered her warmest smile. "I'm Eve. I'm traveling to Montana." "Whereabouts?" "We're heading to Montana ourselves," Katie said. "Helena," she said confidently. A huge smile came over Katie's face. "Oh, the same as us. We can be traveling companions the whole trip." "You're traveling alone?" Robert asked as he sat back in his seat, making himself comfortable. "Yes." The shrill whistle by the platform guard outside had the engine up front respond with a blast of its own, and the train slowly began to lurch forward. After half an hour, Eve had told her entire life story to the couple seated opposite her. They both seemed warm and kind, the sort of people you could speak to for 5 minutes and seem as if you knew for a lifetime. The initial formality Robert had displayed had now eased somewhat. His hat remained pulled down over his head as he sat in the carriage between the women. "We never did catch the name of the man you're going to marry?" Katie asked. "Arthur Hardwick," Eve said with a touch of pride. "He's a few years older than me. I don't think that matters." When she spoke his name, she saw a flash in Robert's eyes. It was almost excitement. Did his body stiffen for just a few seconds? She wasn't sure. It seemed a strange reaction. Then again, Robert's eyes were highly unusual. One was a shade of blue, the other a shade of green. For some reason, they looked far too young to fit his weathered face and long white beard. Maybe she was just imagining it. "Oh no, that sort of thing doesn't matter at all," Katie said casually. She hadn't acknowledged the age difference between herself and Robert, but Eve thought it was certainly implied. "Will you be living on the ranch?" Robert asked. "I guess it's outside of Helena?" "Yes, about 15 miles or so," Arthur said in his letters. "And Arthur owns some other business interests in the town. I'm not sure what." "But he won't be meeting you at the station, I guess because he doesn't know you're coming?" 15 miles is a long way," Robert asked with concern. Katie explained the reason for her sudden flight out west, how it was due to the problems with Crispian Black and her fears for her safety. "That is a concern, Robert. I agree. I wish I'd thought to send a telegram while I was back in St. Paul," she replied. The truth of the matter was that she simply didn't have the money to do so. "I plan to arrive in Helena and ask about Arthur. No doubt, somebody will be able to point me in the direction of one of his business interests in town. From there, I hope someone can get a relatively quick message to him on the ranch. It's not an ideal situation, of course, but I have no doubt Arthur will understand my reasons for leaving the way I did. We'll make sure you're okay, Robert said firmly. I'm not going to leave a young woman like you alone in a strange town. That is very kind, Robert, Eve said, a sudden wave of relief coming over her. It was one of the big concerns she had since the train left New York. Her only thoughts were to escape Crispian. She didn't give much consideration as to what might happen when she arrived in Helena. Aren't you apprehensive about marrying a man you've never met? Katie asked. Of course, Eve confessed. But his letters, Katie, they warmed my heart so much. And as I said, there's nothing left for me in New York other than bad memories. That wasn't strictly true. She still had wonderful memories of her childhood, especially those Christmases spent with her parents. But when she turned 14, her father fell ill, and then her mother followed suit. They became shadows of the people they once were. With her father unable to work, they were forced to move out of their nice tenement building into a slightly less salubrious one. It was still far better than the one she'd been forced into after her parents died, but their standard of living had taken a severe hit. Watching them waste away before her eyes was nothing short of heartbreaking. Even until the day he died, her wonderful papa used to tell her how beautiful and clever she was, and how one day she'd make a great success of her life. Now, as she traveled west with nothing more than a carpet bag, 2 changes of clothing, a parcel of letters, and hope, she clung to her father's words. Chapter 4. I couldn't possibly, Eve protested, flushing red slightly. Please, Robert said. It would do me a great honor. Besides, I haven't seen you eat in quite some time. He paused for a second. In fact, at all. He tilted his head and stroked his beard as he studied her. Eve knew Robert was perfectly correct. She hadn't eaten at all since leaving Chicago, not that he needed to know that. By then, she had eaten the food she had taken with her, and she wanted to keep the few dollars she had left, just in case of a dire emergency. They stopped in Devil's Lake, North Dakota, so the train could take on fuel and water. The stop would last well over an hour. Robert and Katie had offered to buy Eve dinner. However, she felt a great embarrassment accepting their kindness. Well, if you insist, she said, knowing perfectly well her stomach was almost growling. I do, Robert said, marching along the platform. Take care in this snow, Katie. You too, Eve. The 2 women followed in his wake, and he was right about the snow, which had started to fall again 10 minutes before they arrived. At the moment, it wasn't heavy, but the sky grew darker with each passing minute. Eve chatted with Katie as they walked, watching Robert stride ahead. Not for the first time, she was amazed at how the older man managed to walk with such vigor despite his age. Most of the time, Eve remained on the train, but despite the weather, she felt the need for fresh air and to stretch her legs. She'd had no indication that Robert was about to offer to purchase a meal for her. They sat down in a small restaurant to the side of the station. Robert and Katie both ordered steak and eggs with mashed potatoes, so Eve decided to do the same. Wise choice, Robert said. I always like traveling to Montana. The steak you get there is nothing short of spectacular. He smacked his lips together in mock appreciation. Why are you traveling to Montana, then? Eve asked, realizing the question had not yet been addressed. A spot of business, and we're visiting family in the region, Robert said. My brother lives out that way, Katie added with a smile. I wonder if he knows Arthur, Eve said. I haven't seen mention of him in my brother's letters, Katie replied quickly. What business are you in, Robert? Eve asked, thinking the man was probably too old to still be working. Shouldn't someone his age be retired? Legal work is probably the best way to describe it, he said somewhat noncommittally. So when is the wedding planned? Katie asked, just as the food arrived. It seemed a rushed question, and for some reason, Eve thought it might have been asked, so she couldn't follow up on the nature of Robert's business. Eve shrugged her shoulders. I left a little earlier than I expected, so I have no idea, to be honest. However, I would expect it to be soon. I have no desire to stay on a ranch with a man who is not my husband. I have a reputation to consider. Absolutely. Quite right, Katie said, glancing at Robert, who was cutting his steak with relish. So, you'll be marrying in Helena, I assume? Robert asked. I guess so. It's the closest town to the ranch, according to his letters. I don't believe there's anywhere else nearby. Does it not make sense for you to remain in Helena and then get word to your husband to be on his ranch? The wedding can take place in Helena, and then you can travel back to the ranch together as husband and wife? It's what I would do, Robert said matter-of-factly, popping a piece of steak into his mouth. Yes, I guess it does. Eve agreed after some consideration. Then she added, of course, that would mean finding accommodation in the town, and my funds are somewhat limited. I'm sure I could help with that, Robert said. It was obvious the man wasn't short of money, but while she was happy to accept dinner, the prospect of him paying for her accommodation in town was simply out of the question. I couldn't possibly, Robert, but thank you for the offer. No doubt, matters will sort themselves out. Katie nodded. I'm sure they will, but if needed, remember we won't leave you to fend for yourself. That wouldn't be right. It's not Christian, especially at this special time of the year. Eve sighed. That's truly kind of you. Honestly, I appreciate it. You know, I've been so used to standing on my own 2 feet for so long that when someone comes along to help, I know I can sometimes appear ungrateful. I apologize. Not at all, young lady. I understand completely, said Robert. I think my plan makes perfect sense. If you're worried about the finances, I'm sure your man will reimburse me. Eve nodded. I'm sure he will. Deep down, however, nerves began to build. What would happen if Arthur wasn't actually the man he claimed to be? What if she arrived and he turned out not to be some wealthy rancher? What if he looked at her and decided he didn't like her? It was all entirely possible. She guessed these were the worries that many mail-order brides had. She knew that she had to put them to one side. Instead, her mind drifted a few weeks into the future, to Christmas. By then, she would be married. She would be living on a ranch, and she would be enjoying an idyllic Christmas, just like the Christmases she had as a child. She wanted that more than anything. Chapter 5. For the next 2 days, the snow continued to fall relentlessly from the sky. But still, the train kept heading west. Twice, it had to halt unexpectedly so the snow could be cleared from the tracks to allow it to proceed. But progress was still being made, taking Eve closer and closer to her new life. Whenever she looked out the window, all she could see was a world covered in white. Fields, mountains, plains, everything was covered in snow. Robert and Katie continued to ensure she was fed during this leg of the journey. Every time the train stopped at a station, Robert insisted they dine wherever they were. She almost died of shame at having to keep accepting the couple's kindness. Eve hoped that when she eventually met up with Arthur, he would be able to repay their kindness on her behalf. But as the train lurched out of Great Falls, neither her indebtedness to the Mortimers nor the snow was on her mind. They had now left the final stop before Helena. She would soon be stepping off the train and taking the steps to find Arthur. She just prayed he was the man he seemed to be in his letters. There's no need to be nervous, dear, Katie said softly as Robert seemed to doze. She had been studying the young woman for a while and sensed the growing fear within her. I guess it's normal for a woman in my position. Of course, Katie assured her, clasping her hand. What happens if it all goes wrong? Eve asked. Katie sighed. You're a beautiful woman. If it truly does go wrong, and I don't think for a moment that it will, there'll be no shortage of handsome men eager to make your acquaintance. Eve had no time to think about it further because, once more, the train began to grind to a halt. This seemed more urgent than many of the other occasions. There was a small thud and a sudden jolt from the front as the train stopped. It roused Robert from his slumber. What's happening? He asked, opening his eyes and peering out the window. Are we there? I think we've stopped again. Snow, I guess, Katie said. The guard walked past in the passageway. Eve noticed how the man who had been jovial during the journey was now masked with a concerned expression. The anxiety began building further in her chest. They sat there for a few moments. A few men from the carriages farther up stepped out, walking along the track to assess the situation. They saw them point, and Eve heard the words landslip and blocked for hours. Why don't we take a look? Robert said to his wife, who nodded. Do you want to come, Eve? Eve shook her head. No, it looks freezing out there. I think I'll stay here, Robert. Of course, Robert said, climbing nimbly down, defying his age once more, and then supporting his wife off of the train. Steady, dear. Eve sat alone with her thoughts for a few more moments, and then she pulled out the letters from Arthur. She'd read the letters many times during the first 2 legs of her journey, but since St. Paul, she hadn't taken them out of her carpetbag once. It just seemed inappropriate, considering the presence of the Mortimers. But now she read them all again. She could almost recite each letter word for word, but that didn't diminish her enjoyment. As she read, the nerves she felt began to flow away. She knew that when she arrived in Helena and managed to make contact with Arthur, everything would be fine. She traced his signature with her forefinger, just as she had done countless times in the tenement in New York. She imagined a picture of Arthur in her mind, tall, broad, with a chiseled jaw, a wise look in the eye, and a smile that could melt even in this freezing weather. When she was finally with him, her new life could begin. And then suddenly, Eve was pulled from her thoughts by the commotion outside. Raised voices, shouts, and then gunshots. Bandits, she heard someone shout from outside. Her stomach suddenly dropped and her heart raced. She was almost at Helena, but now bandits had struck. The shouting intensified, as did the gunshots. She closed her eyes, dreading to think what might happen if ruthless outlaws found her. She had nothing to offer financially, but she was no fool. She knew she would be a prize for bandits. Quickly, she reached into her carpetbag, stuffed the letters inside, and pulled out her knife. For a moment, she thought about slipping down the passageway to go in search of the guard's compartment, but she knew that would be a ridiculous idea. The guard had already moved towards the front of the train. Besides, the guard's compartment was where any money and valuables would be secured on board. It would be the first to be hit by the bandits. They would find her for sure. There was little she could do but hope and pray that the driver, guard, and the men traveling out west would be able to fight the bandits off. Then, suddenly, she thought of the Mortimers who were outside. She feared for Robert and Katie. They couldn't be caught up in a gunfight. They would stand no chance. So much so that she ended up peering out of the window with a thought of shouting to them to come back. Through the driving snow, steam, and gun smoke, she saw people crouching in fear and shots being exchanged, but she couldn't make out the Mortimers. And then, suddenly, out of nowhere, a man appeared on a jet-black horse. He studied her for a second, and the horse snorted a greeting. "Come with me if you want to live," he said in a firm tone. She held the knife out in front of her. "Don't you come any closer." The man seemed completely unfazed by the presence of the shiny blade. He just shook his head. "I'm not one of the bandits. I own land just west of here. Trust me, if you don't come with me on this horse now, they'll get you. 20 of them at least." He looked her up and down slowly, and then dropped his voice slightly. "I don't think you need me to tell you what will happen then." Although he had looked her up and down like many men did, she didn't feel uncomfortable under his gaze. And he spoke the warning in a kindly tone, without a hint of lecherous intent. She hesitated for another moment, glancing further up the train. A terrible scene was playing out in front of her eyes. A man was screaming. Eve knew what the stranger said was true. She looked back at the man. Strangely, he almost looked like a younger version of the picture she'd just conjured up in her mind of Arthur. She guessed this man was about her own age, perhaps just a few years older. There was something about the calm way he looked at her and the steady tone of his voice that suggested she could trust him. She nodded her head. "I need my bag." She grabbed it, and the man reached out almost effortlessly, opening the carriage door and pulling her onto his horse with one arm. He didn't hesitate for a second. He spurred the animal into motion and cantered away from the devastation that was unfolding behind them. Chapter 6. "Sit down," the stranger said, gesturing to a rocking chair by the fire. "I'll make you coffee. You drink coffee, I assume?" Eve took in her surroundings. The cabin was simple, and she guessed it was likely just a handful of rooms. Log walls framed the space, and an old worn rug lay across the floor. A sturdy dining table with mismatched chairs occupied one corner, while guns hung neatly on the wall. Oil lamps cast long, flickering shadows, giving the room a cozy yet somber air. The man threw another log onto the fire, sending a burst of warmth and light through the room. Ma'am, do you drink coffee? I'd offer you whiskey, considering the circumstances, but I'm not much of a drinker. Yes, I drink coffee. Thank you, she replied, offering a small, hesitant smile. The man nodded, taking off his heavy cape and hung it on a peg near the door. Sit, he insisted, motioning again to the chair. She edged closer to the rocker, hesitating for a moment before sitting. The cabin wasn't unclean, exactly, but it carried the unmistakable air of a man living alone. It was functional, but devoid of the homely touches a woman might bring. She kept her carpet bag firmly on her lap, clutching it as if it were a barrier to the events unfolding around her. The journey to this point had been arduous. They'd ridden for nearly 20 minutes, snow deepening with every step until the horse had no choice but to plod forward at a slow, deliberate pace. Eve had spoken to the man only once during the ride. "Where are we going?" she had asked. "My land, my cabin," he'd replied curtly. She hadn't pressed him further, focusing instead on holding tightly and masking her fear of horseback riding. As they rode, the sounds of gunfire gradually faded, leaving only the crunch of hooves on snow and the soft whistle of the wind. She'd sent up a silent prayer for the Mortimers, hoping they had survived the ordeal. Guilt tugged at her heart, but she knew the stranger had been right. If the bandits had found her, the consequences would have been unthinkable. The man returned from a small adjoining kitchen, holding a steaming mug of coffee. "Here, drink this. You need it," he said, offering the mug. Eve hesitated briefly, as if confused about how to take it from him. "You can put your bag on the floor, ma'am. I must have swept it at least 3 weeks ago." He laughed at his own joke. "Right," she murmured, placing her bag on the floor as he suggested. She took a sip, savoring the warmth that spread through her. His humor caught her off guard. Despite herself, she smiled back. "Thank you. My name is Eve." "Jack," he said simply, pulling a chair from the table closer to the fire. "Thank you for rescuing me, Jack." "Animals," he spat, his face darkening with disgust. "Outlaws who think they can do whatever they please. I watched them sabotage that train, constructed a landslip just to force it off the tracks so they could rob it. And the passengers, of course. Nothing I could do, of course. Far too many of them, and they are connected." Eve stared at him in shock, her hands tightening around the mug. "You mean it wasn't by chance that we stopped? It wasn't just the snow?" "Not at all. It was all planned. Those trains can carry a lot of money at times. Payroll for the workers at the end of the line." "Where were you heading?" "Helena?" Jack nodded his head. "It's about 40 minutes' ride in that direction." He pointed to the fireplace on the opposite wall. "Can you take me?" Eve said softly. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I have someone to meet." Jack smiled. "Of course, but not today. Not in this storm. We'll never make it." Eve nodded her head in understanding. "Tomorrow?" "That will depend on the weather, Miss Eve," Jack said. "But you will be perfectly safe here, I promise." Eve started to glance around. "Where will I sleep? Were there even bedrooms in this cabin? Could there be more than one? And what state might they be in?" Jack pointed to a doorway she hadn't seen in the darkness of the corner. "That leads to the bedrooms. I have one, and there are 2 rooms spare. Small, of course, but they will do." He paused for a moment. "And it's clean, no need to worry about that. Sheets all laundered fresh and everything." Once again he roared with laughter as his own joke. Eve couldn't help but smile at his infectious laugh. "I didn't suggest for a minute that it wasn't." "Are you sure, miss?" Jack said. Still laughing, tilting his head to one side and grinning almost like a naughty schoolboy. Eve blushed because Jack had caught her out. It was perfectly clear what she had been thinking. "Do you live here alone, Jack?" she said, stating what seemed to be the obvious. "Ever since my daddy died. Some 3 years ago now." "My parents are dead as well. I miss them every day." Jack's face turned somber, and he nodded. "My daddy was the wisest man I ever met. My mama, she died when I was little, giving birth to what would have been a sister. My daddy was so in love with her, he never remarried." "That's heartbreaking," Eve said softly. "I'm sorry for your loss, as I am for the loss of your parents. You said you were traveling to Helena to meet someone. Who?" Biting her lip, she considered how to explain. "I'm meeting my future husband. I'm what the papers back east have determined to be a mail-order bride. I had some problems, shall we say, with my boss back in New York. I decided the best way out would be to taste adventure. Well, an adventure you've certainly had, Jack said. Eve nodded, her thoughts drifting back to the Mortimers and what might have become of them. What will happen to the people on board the train? Who did you know on board? Jack asked, hearing the concern in her voice. Just the people I traveled with from St. Paul. An elderly couple, I suppose I would describe them as. They were coming this way to visit family. They were very friendly. I wouldn't want to see anybody hurt, especially them. I'm sure they'll be fine, Jack reassured her. The bandits have attacked the train for one reason: money. There are always a few folks who like to fight back, but as soon as they're silenced, that's the end of it in the vast majority of cases. It's all about the money at the end of the day. He glanced at Eve, and the occasional little extra. She shuddered at the implication, but decided to ignore referring to it. Well, I hope they made it. They were kind to me. I'm sure they did. When we get to Helena, you can ask about them. No doubt that's where most people will have ended up. So do you think we'll be able to leave and get there tomorrow? She asked hopefully. Jack stood up and stretched his back, his broad chest pressing against his shirt at an unnatural angle. She couldn't help but admire his tall, powerful frame. If we can, miss, we certainly will. But if it's too dangerous, then we won't. I've got enough provisions to last us for months. Months? Eve exclaimed, her voice tinged with surprise. Jack laughed again. It won't be months, miss. I'm just saying we've got everything we need here. You're going to be perfectly safe. He raised his hands in the air. I'm no danger, I can assure you. Eve gave him a small smile. I didn't think for a minute that you were, she said softly. Somehow she knew it was true. She might be alone in a strange, handsome man's cabin, but not once did she feel that unsettling fear she'd felt in the presence of Crispian Black. We've got food. It's typical cowboy fare. Nothing grand, I'm afraid, Jack said. Let me assure you, I am not used to grand, Jack. You'd be amazed what I ate back in New York, she replied with a small laugh. Well, you'll fit in very well then, Eve, he said, laughing again as he flashed her a smile and gave her a little wink. Her stomach flipped at the gesture. It was a strange sensation she wasn't used to. It was somewhat concerning. May I get settled into my room before we eat? She asked. Of course, through the door, down the corridor, second door on the right. Honestly, I think you'll find everything you need in there. Thank you very much, Jack. There was no need for you to have done any of this. I hate to see people being taken advantage of, Jack said simply. I was in the vicinity. I could help. Nothing more. After all, you've got a wedding to get yourself to. We can't have anything bad happening to you, could we? No, I'm sure Arthur would completely agree, Eve said with a faint smile. Jack had been walking toward the kitchen area, but suddenly he froze. She saw his entire body stiffen, and then he turned to her slowly. Arthur? Yes, Eve said, tilting her head slightly. That's the name of my fiancé. You might know him. He has a ranch, Arthur Hardwick. Jack paused for a moment, his expression hardening as he gave her a long, deliberate look. Oh yes, I've heard the name. Chapter 7. The bedroom was exactly as Jack had described. She almost gasped when she opened the door and saw it. It seemed in stark contrast to the rest of the house. It was immaculately clean, and she couldn't help but sniff the laundry. Yes, Jack had spoken the truth. It did appear to be freshly laundered. She took half an hour to rest, as Jack had suggested, while he prepared dinner. He had warned her again it would be simple cowboy fare. Lying on the bed, she prayed that the Mortimers had made it through the ordeal and reached Helena safely. She also prayed that the snow would stop so Jack could take her to Arthur. But there was Jack's strange reaction when she told him she was to be married to Arthur Hardwick. It was almost as if he couldn't believe it. He had acted oddly for just a few seconds before resuming the same calm demeanor he had maintained since rescuing her. Maybe, with everything she'd been through over the last few hours, she was just imagining it. Still, it felt as though Jack and Arthur shared some kind of history. A shared history Jack didn't seem to view fondly. She brushed off the thoughts, knowing she was overthinking this. Jack probably had heard of Arthur, as he was a successful businessman in the area, and was now surprised that he had rescued his bride-to-be. She managed to stop herself from falling asleep, pulled herself off the surprisingly comfortable bed, and freshened up. She had been traveling in the same dress ever since leaving New York City. Deciding it was time for a change, she chose one of the two she had packed in her carpet bag. She selected the green one. She would change into the blue to meet Arthur. She liked the way she looked in it the most. Pulling out a comb, she spent 10 minutes untangling her hair in front of the mirror. Simple pleasures like that had been rare while traveling. When she returned, she found Jack sitting in the same chair by the fire, a mug of coffee in his hand. He was staring at the dancing flames, seemingly lost in thought. "The room is very pleasant, Jack. You were right," she said, taking the seat she had occupied earlier. Jack looked startled by her presence and then flashed that already familiar smile. "I told you. Can I help with dinner? I feel awfully guilty after everything you've done for me that I haven't been able to contribute. It'll be done in 10 minutes, I'd say. Although, if this weather keeps up the way it's going, there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to show your prowess in the kitchen." His eyes flicked to the window. She stood, walked over, and peered outside. The snow was falling thickly. "You can hardly see anything out there." "This storm is a bad one," he said. "I don't remember snowfall like this in, 8 years or more." "How long have you lived here?" "All my life. I was born in the old barn before it got burnt down," he replied. "How old were you when your mother passed?" she asked gently. 7, Jack said abruptly. "It was 3 days after New Year's Day when it happened. She died along with my baby sister, who she was trying to bring into the world. She had been in labor since New Year's Day." "I'm so sorry," she said. She couldn't imagine what it must have been like to lose a mother so young, to be raised out here, in the harshness of nature, by only a father. It must have been a tough life for a young boy. "It happens," Jack replied, almost nonchalantly. She sensed this was a deeply emotional subject for him, one he wasn't keen to discuss further. She decided to steer the conversation in a different direction. "So, this is a ranch. I guess technically it's still called a homestead," Jack said, "but my daddy had dreams of making it a huge ranch. Prosody rate. I still have that little candle burning somewhere deep inside me, despite everything." He looked away from her and stared back into the dancing flames. "What do you mean, despite everything? Has there been some sort of problem?" she asked after a moment's pause to weigh up if she should ask. He sat silent for a few seconds, and for a few seconds, Eve thought that he wasn't going to answer her. "Business complications, shall we say?" he finally replied. Turning back to her, he knowingly raised his eyebrows as he stood. "Right, let's see what's in the pot, shall we?" Clearly it was a nothing answer, and Eve wasn't really surprised. It was none of her business after all. When he mentioned food, she realized just how hungry she was. That would be absolutely wonderful. "Go sit. I'll be 5 minutes," Jack said, pointing to the table. He disappeared into the kitchen area. Eve did exactly as she was told, and less than 5 minutes later, he appeared with 2 steaming bowls. Bacon and beans. "Like I said, traditional cowboy food. We've got some bread as well," Jack said, placing a bowl in front of her. He returned with what appeared to be a freshly baked loaf and set it in the center of the table. Then he handed her a spoon. "Excuse the cutlery. Never had much need for fancy stuff. We don't have a lot of that out here," he said. "This looks delicious," Eve said, telling a small white lie. She had to admit, it looked less than appetizing. "Don't worry about the cutlery." She looked at it thinking that it looked perfectly acceptable. "Where did you get the idea I'm all fancy?" "All city girls are fancy, aren't they?" Jack said with a laugh as he pulled a chair away from the fireside and sat opposite her. "No, certainly not. Have you ever visited the city?" she asked, taking a hesitant first taste of the bacon and beans. Despite its plain appearance, it was flavorsome. It was certainly warm and nourishing, which was what she needed. Her face changed slightly after swallowing it, allowing herself a slight smile at the comforting feeling it gave her. "Good?" Jack asked while watching her closely. Eve nodded and attacked the bowl again. Jack was pleased and then answered her question. "In terms of whether I've visited the city? No, the furthest I've traveled is probably no further than 100 miles from here. I've never had any need to go. I don't expect I will." "I suppose not," she said. It made sense. The same was true of her. Until her journey out west, she hadn't traveled far beyond New York. Jack reached out, tore the loaf of bread in half, and handed her half. She took it and smiled. "Thank you." She tore off a piece and was surprised by how fresh it felt. "Did you bake this yourself?" she asked before popping it into her mouth. Just like the bacon and beans, it tasted good. "Sure did. It's one of my skills. My mama taught me well. She taught me when she was pregnant, just before she died." His face then dropped, and his tone grew somber. It was almost like she knew it was going to happen. She was preparing me to be able to cook and look after myself and my daddy. "You've cooked since your mother died?" she asked, imagining what it must have been like for a young boy just 7 years old to have to feed himself and his father. Jack dipped his bread into the bacon and beans, letting the juices soak in. "My daddy was a real man's man. The only time he would cook was out in the wilds. He didn't think it was his job in life." He tilted his head and gave a half-hearted grin. "He didn't seem to mind me doing it, though. I can't say I'm an expert, mind you. I've got about 5 basic meals I can cook, but I'm still here, still surviving." She held his gaze for a moment, captivated by that playful grin. Once more, she felt a strange tingling in her stomach, just like earlier. She forced herself to look away, feeling her cheeks redden slightly under his watchful eyes. "So you've never married?" she asked, genuinely curious. Jack was, after all, a handsome man. She guessed him to be a few years older than herself. It seemed strange that he didn't yet have a wife. Jack shook his head. "My daddy was on about it in his final years. Said it was time. He was right. Of course. I'd like to marry and have sons and daughters of my own, have somebody to share this with, and have a son to pass this place down to." He glanced around as he said the words as if studying the cabin. "But I'm 40 minutes' ride from the nearest town. I don't get out much to meet women. Not that there are many in Helena anyway." She smiled at his joke. "What about advertising for a mail-order bride like Arthur did?" Jack stiffened slightly at the mention of Arthur's name. Eve wondered if she might have imagined it again, and it could be that he was just shifting his weight in his chair. "I doubt I'd be as lucky as him with the woman who showed up." Once more, her cheeks flushed, this time at the obvious compliment he was paying her. They sat in silence for a few seconds, both somewhat embarrassed. Jack realized he might have overstepped. "Sorry if I made you uncomfortable. I just don't get many beautiful women sharing my cooking out here." They both laughed, and Eve felt oddly comfortable in the man's presence. Eve nodded. "Well, I could say I don't meet many handsome strangers who rescue me." As soon as the words left her mouth, she almost regretted them. It felt somehow like a betrayal of Arthur. She quickly moved the conversation to a less sensitive subject. "So do you have cattle?" "A few," Jack said gruffly. "I had trouble with rustlers this year." He paused for a second before continuing. "Trouble with more than a few things." "Trouble? You mentioned it earlier," Eve pressed. "It's not easy running a homestead, or ranch, whatever you want to call it, out here. When things go wrong, they really go wrong. I'm pretty sure somebody's trying to make things difficult for me, trying to get me to sell this land cheap. But I won't go. We'll see how next year pans out. I'm guessing someone will make me an offer for this place soon enough." "Who would do that?" "Big operators, folks looking to build huge businesses. Could be any number of people," Jack said quickly. Somehow she sensed he wasn't telling the whole story, but she knew that none of this was her business. They finished the meal talking about lighter matters. Jack seemed highly amused that she didn't know how to ride a horse. For some reason, he seemed to think everyone in the city traveled on horseback. He was shocked to learn that people walked everywhere, or, if they were rich, used carriages. A sudden weariness came over her as she finished her meal. She covered her mouth with her hand and yawned. "That was wonderful, Jack. Thank you again for everything you are doing for me. There was no need to put yourself at risk." Jack nodded. "Yes, there was. I saw you peering out that window, and I knew I had to get you out of there. Rest assured, you'll be safe here tonight. You're lucky with the snow, too. This being your first night in Montana, I'd guess the noises outside will be a bit different from what you're used to in the city." "What do you mean by noises?" "Animals, wolves, Cougars, elk, owls, the wind howling. Like I said, you're lucky with the snow. Any animal with an ounce of sense will have found shelter by now. If you hear anything, don't be alarmed. It's just normal out here. She nodded in understanding. If you don't mind, I think I'll retire now. It's been a long and eventful day. Jack stood from the table. Of course. Sleep well. Let's see what tomorrow brings, though I doubt we'll be able to make it to Helena and your husband-to-be. Chapter 8. That night, before going to bed, Eve said her prayers as she always did. First, she prayed for the Mortimers, asking that they had been delivered safely from the horrors that had unfolded on the train. Then she prayed for Jack, that he would continue being the decent, upright man he seemed to be, and she thanked God for the fact he had rescued her. Finally, she prayed for Arthur, asking that his business be successful and that he was in good health. Afterward, she couldn't help but think about Arthur. She was thankful that he still had no idea she had been on that train. The last thing she wanted was for him to worry. If she had telegrammed from St. Paul, he might think the bandits had made off with her. At least now, she could try to find him whenever the storm cleared, and it would still be a complete surprise. As she crawled under the covers, she couldn't help but hear Jack's voice in her head warning her about the noises she might hear. In many ways, she actually wanted to hear some of the animals he had mentioned. Of course, some, like the elk, Eve had no idea what they looked like, but she imagined all kinds of weird and wonderful creatures as she lay there. Eve listened, but all she could hear was the wind. She fell asleep somewhat disappointed. However, she woke up briefly a little past midnight and could have sworn that, mixed in with the wind, were the cries of wolves in the distance. Instead of scaring her, it moved her deeply, thinking that the creature was crying out in sorrow. As she drifted back to sleep, she knew that here in Montana she could be very happy. All she had to do was reach Arthur. Even though they were in the depths of winter and Christmas wasn't far off, when she woke, light was peeking through the curtains. She knew she must have slept for hours. Her nose detected a delicious aroma in the air. Coffee was brewing for sure, but there was something else as well: bacon. She realized once again that she was ravenous. The wilderness seemed to give her an appetite. She dressed quickly and emerged from her room, walking down the corridor. Jack's bedroom door was shut, and the living room looked as it had the day before. It was in stark contrast to the room she had slept in. The bedroom had been light and spotlessly clean. The living room was dark, and it definitely needed a good sweeping. Jack's jokes about doing it 3 weeks ago were probably true. If she were the mistress of this cabin, it would be swept daily, perhaps twice daily. A mirror should be put up to reflect light. There should be homey touches on the walls and more comforting furniture. But she wasn't the mistress. She was merely a guest. She'd already accepted that today she probably wouldn't be able to make it to Helena to see Arthur. She could see for herself that snow was still falling thickly. She wondered if Jack would be offended if she offered to clean a little. She walked into the kitchen, which was a simple enough space. However, as she glanced around, she realized it was probably better equipped than her tenement back in New York. The items were old, but they were functional. Jack turned and stopped in his tracks, surprised by her presence. "You gave me a right shock there," he said. "A man living alone for so long isn't used to somebody standing behind him." He paused for the briefest of moments before adding, "Especially a beautiful woman." A warm smile spread across his face, and yet again Eve felt that tingling sensation in her stomach. Her cheeks flushed at the compliment, and a sudden pang of guilt hit her. She realized she liked hearing the handsome cowboy compliment her. She had to remind herself about Arthur, the man she was coming to Montana to marry. "Good morning, Jack. I slept wonderfully in that bed." "I thought you would. It was my mama's room. No one has slept there since she passed." She jumped, a little in shock at the casual revelation. "Your mama's room?" "Yep. My mama and my daddy had separate rooms. He used to get up at ungodly hours and didn't want to disturb her. Seemed to work well enough. Apparently the English royal family does it, so it must be good." She nodded, suddenly understanding why the room felt so different from the rest of the house. A heartbreaking twinge of sorrow hit her. Jack had kept the room as a shrine to his mother. That's why it was the only space that had been cleaned, and why the sheets had been freshly laundered. It was almost as if he were waiting for her return in some way. "I feel honored," she said, guilt gnawing at her again. This time, it wasn't about Arthur, but about the fact that she had intruded on Jack's memory of his mother. "Honored?" Jack asked, confused. "Allowing me to sleep in your mother's bed? Invading the space like that?" Jack let out an infectious roar of laughter. "Oh, don't be silly. I know one thing for sure. My mama taught me manners before she passed. I can only imagine what she'd think if I made a woman who'd almost been kidnapped by bandits sleep on the floor." "She wouldn't have been impressed," he said, raising his eyebrows as if recalling one of his mother's scoldings. "That's very kind of you. And now, in the light of day, I need to thank you again, Jack. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along and rescued me." "Don't think about it. It's better that way," Jack replied, turning back to the stove. "Bacon? Eggs? That would be wonderful. You have fresh eggs out here?" "Sure do. There's a whole series of outbuildings out back. You wouldn't have seen them when we arrived, especially in this weather. As your bedroom faces the front, you might not have noticed. There's a chicken coop, barn, stabling, and other buildings. This is a homestead, after all. I grow what I can, I keep what livestock I can, and hunt what I can. Deer is a favorite. We even have an ice house out there. Not that we need it at present, of course." She laughed softly. She couldn't help but warm to Jack. For someone who lived alone and had done so for some time, he seemed to have an easy way with people. Back in New York, she'd learned that some men were intimidated by her, not because of her personality, but because of her looks. Others would stare openly, often dragged away by their wives. Jack, though, was different. He clearly appreciated her beauty, but he wasn't shy or lecherous. Not at all like Crispian Black. "You seem to have everything you need," she remarked. Jack turned with the skillet in his hand, ready to serve the food. He paused, and a shadow of sadness crossed his face. "Not everything." She understood what he meant. He might have land, food, and shelter, but what he craved was family. "I'll take these through. Do you want coffee? Would you mind pouring?" Jack asked, tilting his head toward the coffee pot. "That would be wonderful. Of course I don't mind," she replied. Glancing out the window at the relentlessly falling snow, she added, "I take it we're not going to Helena today." "No, Eve, not today. And even if this relents, it might not be tomorrow either. It would be too dangerous in the drifts," Jack said, taking the plates through 4. She poured 2 mugs of coffee and joined Jack in the other room. Sitting opposite him, she marveled at his energy. He must have a hearty appetite to keep up with the demands of running the place. Even in a snowstorm, she imagined, his work never truly stopped. While they ate, she ventured, "Speaking of pulling my weight, I hope you won't be offended by what I'm about to say." Jack put his fork down, a boyish grin spreading across his face. "This is going to be interesting," she laughed. "Maybe I could clean up a little around here." She glanced around as she spoke. Jack pretended to look shocked. "Oh, I'm appalled. What are you trying to say?" he asked in a mock-serious tone. For a moment, she worried she had offended him, but then he laughed again. "Of course, you can clean. Those words are music to my ears. I keep Mama's room how it should be, how she would want it. It's easy enough since nobody goes in there. The rest, though," he trailed off with a shrug. She smiled, relieved. "I wasn't trying to imply." "It's fine," Jack interrupted. "I know what you mean. Yes, I'd love for you to clean if that's what you'd like to do. After we have eaten, I have to go and work. Chickens and cattle need to be fed, despite the snow. I can show you where everything else is as well." An hour later, Eve glanced at the fire and wished it wasn't roaring quite so fiercely. She had built up quite a sweat. First, she dusted down the ceilings and walls, then she swept the living area vigorously. Jack was right. It clearly had not been done in weeks. It already looked considerably better. But she decided she wasn't stopping there. Over the next hour, she scrubbed, scraped, and polished wherever she could. When she was done, she stood in the middle of the room, hands on her hips, and looked around with a touch of self-satisfaction. As she glanced around, she considered what else it needed. A rug on the floor, a mirror on the wall, curtains over the windows, and a few knickknacks on the mantelpiece for starters. Then she would get a cushion for the chair, a blanket for the knees, and maybe a picture or portrait for the wall. She decided in her mind where everything would go. Then she checked herself. This wasn't her cabin. It never would be. But she couldn't help thinking what a homely and wonderful place it could become with a few delicate feminine touches. Her mind drifted, and she began to wonder how Arthur's ranch might appear in comparison. From his letters, she had the impression it was impressive. She wondered if he cleaned as infrequently as Jack. Perhaps he employed someone to do it? Arthur was a successful businessman, so that would make sense. She wondered if, when she arrived, there would be no need for her to do any of these tasks. Strangely enough, that thought brought a hint of disappointment. One thing she had always enjoyed back in New York was ensuring that her tenement looked its best. Despite her limited resources and the state of the physical building, it was always clean and tidy. She wondered what Jack did over Christmas. Did he decorate the place with a touch of greenery? A sprig or two would look wonderful on the mantelpiece, and perhaps a tree in the corner. Then she laughed at herself. A man who lived alone and didn't sweep the floor for weeks on end almost certainly did not decorate his home for Christmas. "What are you laughing at?" A voice suddenly came from behind her. She turned to see Jack standing with snow on his wide shoulders and hat. She hadn't heard him enter. He must have come in through the kitchen door at the back. She smiled at him. "Nothing, just a thought," she replied. It was only then that Jack seemed to take in his surroundings and notice her work. "Oh my, that's amazing. 2 hours work, and I swear it hasn't been this clean since Mama was here. She'd have liked you for sure." "I'm just glad I was able to help a little," Eve replied, pleased once more at the compliment. She watched as Jack removed his cape and stretched his back. He was tall, broad, and strong, his chest thick from years of exertion on the homestead. He was the sort of man any woman could easily fall in love with. She pushed the thought aside, once more struck by pangs of guilt. She wasn't here to marry Jack. She wasn't here to live in this cabin. She needed to get to Arthur. She knew she needed to get there as soon as possible, because she rather feared that the longer she stayed in the cabin with Jack, the less inclined she would become to leave. Chapter 9. "This is amazing," Eve said after taking her first mouthful of the venison stew that had been bubbling on the stove since before breakfast. "One of my favorites, for sure. I've still got a haunch of it left, but I won't be able to hunt for a while in this weather," Jack said, a hint of sadness in his voice. At lunchtime, they dined on another freshly baked loaf with cold beef and cheese. It was another simple yet filling meal. She spent the afternoon cleaning the kitchen area, rearranging the cookware, tableware, and utensils in what she thought was a more logical order. Then she felt a pang of guilt, remembering once again that this wasn't going to be her kitchen. When Jack came in from his afternoon's work, she apologized, but he shook his head and said it had needed organizing for years. She had also discovered the larder to the rear of the kitchen and had marveled at how well stocked it was. Jack could live for months here without issue. Now they were sitting down, enjoying the venison stew. "I've never had venison," Eve admitted. Jack's jaw nearly hit the floor. "You've never eaten venison? What do they even eat in the city?" "Well, I'll be honest," she said, blushing slightly. "I rarely had meat on the wages I was earning back in New York. Vegetable soups, stews, bread, and hard cheese, those were my staples. Occasionally I'd get a bit of chicken for a stew or maybe some beef, but that was rare. See, I told you I wasn't fancy." Jack shook his head in disbelief. "Meat 3 times a day here for me." Eve shrugged. "It's a different way of living for sure. I have to say, though, I like it." For a while, they talked about the continuing storm and the challenges it brought. A sudden thought crossed Eve's mind. "You know, Jack, I don't even know what day it is." The man let out a hearty, infectious laugh. "That's life out here for you. One day merges into another." "Yes, but with all the traveling and the sudden rush, Saturday?" Jack shook his head. "Sunday. Sorry we weren't able to make it to church, but in all this weather," this time they both laughed. "You manage to go to church?" Eve asked. "I do, but not every week, I confess. especially in weather like this, but as often as I can, I figure the Lord hears my prayers wherever I am. Eve nodded thoughtfully. Sunday? So that makes it just 8 days until Christmas then. I guess it does, Jack replied, a note of sadness in his voice. You don't keep Christmas? You don't like it? Eve asked. I did as a child. Best time of the year back then. But these days, Jack trailed off, dipping his bread into the stew. I've got no one to share it with. Seems like a waste of time if you ask me. That's sad. You need to get yourself a wife, Jack. You're probably right. This cabin needs another person living in it. Now that you've tidied up this place, maybe a woman wouldn't run a mile at the sight of it. I'm sure no woman would run a mile from you, Jack, she said with a smile. Then immediately she regretted her words. She knew this wasn't right. She was here to marry Arthur. What would he think if he knew she was living under another man's roof and making comments like that? She vowed she would check herself and her comments in the future. However, she also knew she had no choice but to go with Jack. As he had said, if she had stayed on the train, the bandits would have taken her for sure. She knew that Arthur would understand. I'll see what the new year brings, Jack said, completely ignoring the compliment she paid him. I know what you mean about Christmas as a child, though, Eve said, her voice softening. I used to adore them back in New York with my parents, but since they've been gone, it's never been quite the same. Jack smiled sympathetically. Sounds like you need somebody to share them with, too. Yes, I'll be glad to get to Arthur, hopefully in time for Christmas. In fact, I am hoping to be married to him by then. Jack simply grunted and attacked his stew. Eve studied him for a moment before deciding to press the subject. You said you've heard of Arthur, didn't you? What do you know about him? Jack shifted a little in his chair. Came here about 5 years ago, I think. Built a ranch. I understand he has some business interests in town. He owns part of the saloon for sure. He's involved in the mercantile, supplying goods in some way. He knows the lawyer pretty well. Jack raised his eyebrows when he said this and gave a little chuckle. He's getting involved in the lumber business as well, at least if the rumors around town are true. Eve noted the change in Jack's tone. She didn't hear much of his answer. She was worrying about the first business interest he mentioned. Part of the saloon? Jack nodded but offered no further details. Doesn't sound like a very wholesome business interest, she pressed. It makes money, he replied simply. She ate her stew in silence, considering what Jack had said. She knew a little about saloons, aside from the drinking. She had seen enough of the horrors that drink could bring to a man while living in her tenement in New York. When Jack had brought her back to the cabin and told her he wasn't much of a drinker, it had eased a certain portion of her concern about him after her rescue. When they were drunk, men did stupid things. But drink wasn't her only worry regarding a saloon. On the train, Robert Mortimer had told her in no uncertain terms that she must avoid saloons when attempting to find Arthur in Helena. It wasn't just the drink, it was the gamblers, the criminals, and all manner of illicit activities that went on there. The thought that Arthur might actually own one of these establishments, or even frequent them, did not sit well with her. However, she reasoned that probably it was simply a financial investment. He had said he only owned part of the saloon. Maybe he had given a friend some money and was happy to take a share of the profits. After all, businessmen made money where they could. Then her mind flicked to that strange comment Jack had made about Arthur being friends with a lawyer. She hadn't registered it at first, her thoughts occupied with the saloon. What did it mean? It was clearly laced with hidden meaning. She looked up and opened her mouth to ask the question, but decided against it. For some reason, Jack seemed lost in thought. His head was down, and he was focused on his bowl. Eve could tell that the conversation had upset him. She decided a change of subject was needed. So tell me about these dreams you have, Jack. Turning this place into a big ranch. At that, Jack's eyes lit up. We've had plenty of dreams about that over the years. Eve, it was my dad's great dream to be one of the big ranch owners of Montana. There's a small mine, on our land as well. Tiny in comparison to some of the other places out here, mind. We only discovered it 6 months before my daddy died. I've only done a few explorations there, but who knows what riches might lie beneath. Well, that sounds exciting. Why haven't you explored it more? Just a question of time, really. Most of the time, I'm just trying to put food on my plate and keep the place running. Eve knew very well that Jack needed a wife. He could then concentrate on running the ranch aspect, and his wife could look after the cabin, cook, and help around the place. She knew that for some woman somewhere, it would be a wonderful life. It's good to have dreams, though, Jack. You should hang on to them. He nodded his head. Oh, I will, no matter how hard people try to fight me. Chapter 10. That night in bed, Eve indulged herself by reading Arthur's letters from beginning to end once more. While she read, she once more fell in love with the man who had written them. His words conveyed warmth, empathy, and a character she believed to be upright and moral. By the time she finished, the concerns she had felt around the dining table were gone. She knew that Christmas would soon be here, and she wanted nothing more than to spend it in the arms of her husband. She tried to imagine what Arthur would look like. Strangely, though, his appearance seemed to blur and shift until it resembled Jack's. Even before she had met Jack, she had conjured an image of Arthur in her mind that was similar to Jack, only more than 10 years older. But now, even that image had faded, and it was Jack's face that appeared in her mind as she drifted off to sleep. When she woke, her memories of that were forgotten. She looked out of the window to see that the storm had turned into nothing more than the merest of snow flurries. She emerged from her room and saw no sign of Jack anywhere. She walked out to the back of the kitchen and onto the small porch. She hadn't yet stood there since arriving at the cabin. The storm had been too fierce and the temperature too cold. But now, with the snowfall eased, she could finally take in the view Jack had described previously. She saw the large barn, the chicken coop, a small building she guessed was the ice house, and a range of wooden structures alongside two small stone ones. Off to the right, she spotted a stable, where a horse's head peeked over one of the doors. She heard soft, tuneful whistling coming from that direction, and saw Jack's hat bobbing up and down inside the stable. Clearly, he was working in there. She decided she would surprise him by preparing breakfast. She went into the larder and retrieved bacon, eggs, potatoes, and beans. She put coffee in the pot. Less than half an hour later, the meal was ready. She walked back out onto the porch to see where Jack was. She saw him emerging from the chicken coop and waved her hand in greeting. "Breakfast is ready," she shouted. He raised his hand in acknowledgement and began walking back to the cabin. The snow was still thick, almost reaching his knees. "Good morning. You found the porch then," Jack said with his now very familiar grin. "It's a nice little spot here, looking out over the buildings. I like it, especially in the summer. It offers a little shade from the sun. You can't see the beds because of the snow, but I grow some vegetables out here as well. Did I hear you say something about breakfast?" "You certainly did, Jack. Come inside," she said, turning and waving her arm as if ushering him inside. Then she shook her head slightly, embarrassed, knowing that she was inviting the man into his own home. Jack didn't seem to think anything of it. "Absolutely. You know, this will be the first meal I've had cooked here by somebody else since Mama died. I occasionally get to eat in Helena when I go to church, but usually I'm just there for the service and head straight back." She couldn't help but feel sorry for him as she followed him inside. It didn't seem right that a man had to cook for himself, especially when he clearly had so much work to do. He needed somebody to look after him a little. He needed someone to love. She watched him devour the meal. She realized it felt good to feed a man. The look of pleasure on his face as he finished eating and pushed his plate away brought her an intense sense of contentment. "That was just amazing," Jack said, patting his stomach. She laughed. "Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I've never cooked for anyone other than my parents before." "You can cook for me any day of the week, that's for sure," Jack said, smiling at her as he studied her face. She smiled back and held his gaze, suddenly noticing how beautiful his eyes were. She had never studied a man's eyes in such detail before. His eyes spoke of stories of fun, laughter, and mischief, but there was something else there as well. After a few moments of thought, she knew there was a touch of sorrow lurking there too. It was Jack who broke the gaze first. "It seems like the weather has turned. The storm looks to be over. I'd suggest that tomorrow we make our way to Helena." "Tomorrow? Really? Do you think so?" She was a little taken aback at the suddenness of it. "That would be wonderful. I suggest we head there instead of going directly to your husband-to-be's ranch. It might be more difficult to reach. After we leave my land, there's a decent track we can follow that's a little sheltered. It probably won't be too covered in snowdrifts." "Whatever you think is best," she said softly. "I'll make sure you're not stranded in town, though. I'll ensure you reach your man." "Thank you, Jack. That's very kind of you." He thought it strange, the way he had phrased those sentences. Your man and husband-to-be. It was almost as if he couldn't bear to say his name. "I do have a little business to take care of in town as it is," he added, almost dismissively. "I'll try to do that before everything closes up for Christmas." He made it sound incidental, but she knew perfectly well that he was going out of his way to help her. Once more, she couldn't have been more grateful. "You know, I'd like to see around the buildings out back," she said. "If that's what you'd like, that's what I'll show you. But we need to change your footwear, and you need something else." He glanced down at his feet and shook his head. "Wait here, and I'll see what I can find." He disappeared into the kitchen and was gone for almost 10 minutes before he returned with a pair of boots and a thick coat. "They smell very musty, I'm afraid," he said. "They were my mama's. We kept them in storage. I don't know why. Maybe for a reason such as this." "Are you sure?" she asked, looking at him. Not only had the man allowed her to sleep in his mother's bed, but now he was offering his mother's clothing. "Of course. Remember, my mama taught me manners. We don't want you catching a chill in time for Christmas. Surely you want to be able to enjoy it." She suddenly felt a touch of joy in her heart at the thought of being with Arthur in time for Christmas. Then guilt crept in because she realized that while she would be enjoying the festivities with her new husband, Jack would be here at the cabin, alone. And then, all at once, she realized something else. She would be sad to leave this cabin. Chapter 11. The next day, Eve woke to glorious blue skies. It was almost as if the snowstorm had never occurred. She suddenly realized that today was the day she was going to finally meet her future husband. At least, hopefully. That was assuming messages could be sent to him from Helena and he could travel from his own ranch. But at least she would be one step closer. She also hoped to learn the fate of the Mortimers. She continued to pray that they had made it through the horrors of the train attack safely. She hoped that today she would be blessed with good news about them. Eve dressed as carefully as she could, knowing the importance of a first impression. She knew her clothes needed a good laundering, and she would address that as soon as she reached Arthur's ranch. She combed out the tangles in her hair, packed her carpet bag, and made the bed neatly. She felt guilty about leaving the bedding unwashed, but what could she do? Knowing the amount of care Jack took over the room, she had no doubt he would tend to it almost immediately upon his return. As her thoughts drifted to Jack once again, she felt yet another pang of guilt. He seemed like a man after her own heart, someone who could truly enjoy the festive season under the right circumstances. It didn't seem right for him to return here to spend Christmas alone. A small idea played at the back of her mind. She didn't think too deeply about it, as the right circumstances might not arise. But if they did, she vowed to take action. Jack deserved a good Christmas. Jack greeted her in the kitchen in the same jovial manner as he had done every morning. This time, he was at the stove, skillet in hand, preparing eggs and bacon to eat before their journey. They ate quickly, with minimal conversation. As the meal progressed, Eve sensed a sadness in Jack that she hadn't noticed before. She wondered what was causing it. "Right, we'd better be going. I don't know how long the journey will take. On a good summer day, it might be 40 minutes. Today, it'll be double, if not triple that." "Listen, before we go, Jack, I just want to thank you again," Eve began. Jack held up a palm and shook his head. "No, Miss Eve, I want to thank you. It's been a pleasure hosting you here in the cabin. You've made me see some things I've been running from. I think, come the new year, I'll place an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times for a bride of my own." Eve suddenly felt an unfamiliar sensation: jealousy. She immediately pushed it aside and dismissed it as foolish. What on earth did she have to feel jealous about? But then she realized something very strange. She didn't want another woman in this cabin. She didn't want someone else cooking for Jack or someone else sweeping the living room floor. Horrified at the thoughts floating about in her head, she reminded herself that she was about to leave this place and go to Arthur. With the right set of circumstances, she could be married in a few hours. She couldn't be feeling this way. Instead, she offered a warm smile. "That's excellent news, Jack. I think that's exactly what you need." He nodded but said nothing more. Just before he turned, she half thought that she saw a tear in his eye. Then it hit her. The reason she sensed the sadness in Jack was the fact that he didn't want her to leave. He paused just before picking up his cape. "I'd like you to take my mom's boots and coat. You need to be equipped for the winter. You'll need them for the journey, and you may as well keep them." Eve gasped, thrown off her original train of thought. "Jack, I couldn't possibly." "I insist. It would do me a great honor if you would." Eve couldn't bring herself to refuse this gift. Instead, she nodded. "Thank you, Jack. I appreciate it, truly." She paused for a second, wondering whether to bring up the subject of why he was feeling sad that she was leaving. But then she decided against it. Such a conversation would only get complicated. It was best to move on. They walked out to the stables. The snow had been cleared slightly from Jack's constant back and forth trips to the outbuildings, and so there was a narrow path to follow. Yesterday afternoon, they had spent a pleasant 2 hours walking around the outbuildings, following this very path. Eve had patted the horses and even fed one a shriveled apple. At first, she was nervous, but thanks to Jack's constant encouragement, by the end, she was beginning to feel a little more comfortable around the beasts. She knew that one day, she would enjoy learning to ride. She found the ice house fascinating, even though it was actually colder outside than it probably was inside. Huge blocks of ice were stacked neatly. Jack explained how he used a small pick to smash them up and keep food from spoiling in the corner of the larder. Eve had a great adventure in the chicken coop, and they had dined this morning on the eggs she had retrieved that afternoon. She hoped Arthur's ranch would have chickens, ice houses, and stables with friendly horses. If it was anything like Jack's cabin, she knew she would be very happy there. Jack quickly saddled the horse and helped her up. She rode in front of him. He grasped her firmly with one strong arm, and she felt that familiar, uncomfortable flutter in her stomach once more. She enjoyed the sensation of being held close by him and hoped that, when Arthur did the same, she would feel something similar. She looked back with affection as they rode past the cabin and into the distance. She hoped that one day Jack would have a bride of his own and the cabin would be full of children excitedly waiting for Christmas. But now she had to look to her own future. She tried to conjure up the image of Arthur in her mind as the horse pressed forward. She wanted to see the look of surprise and delight on his face when she arrived. She wanted him to gaze at her with appreciation and savor her beauty. She wanted him to be the kind, honest, upright man he appeared to be in his letters. The horse made slow progress through the snow, but each step was another step closer to Arthur. It was another step closer to her husband-to-be. It was another step closer to the rest of her life, a life of wealth and promise. So Eve had to question as the horse plodded through the drifts. Given all of that, why did she suddenly feel so sad? Chapter 12. The ride into Helena was indeed arduous. At times, the snow seemed so deep, she doubted the horse would make it through, but Jack expertly and confidently guided the animal forward. "I know every single inch of these tracks," he reassured Eve, his voice low and steady in the frosty air. Eve couldn't help but be struck by the beauty of it all. The trees, the rivers, the valleys, the hills, and in the distance, the mountains. It seemed like a place that had been built personally by God. "It is taking longer than usual, just like I said it would." "We're only just leaving my land," Jack said after they'd been traveling for a little more than half an hour. "We are only just off your land? And you call this a homestead?" Eve laughed, glancing back at Jack. "It's huge. Maybe to a city girl like you, but not out here." Keep holding on to your daddy's dreams, Jack. One day, you'll have the biggest ranch in Montana. I just know it. He gave a small squeeze of her waist in acknowledgement, and once again, those familiar butterflies stirred in her stomach. The rest of the journey passed with little conversation. Eve couldn't help but take in every single inch of the majestic landscape. Finally, after what seemed like an age, Jack pointed to the buildings visible in the distance. "Helena," he said simply. Eve wasn't sure what she had expected, but it was nothing like this. In her mind, she had thought it would be nothing more than a mining camp with a few central buildings. But this was more refined, more elegant, especially closer to the center. A mixture of miners with mud on their boots, cowboys with huge hats, and refined gentlemen wearing tailored suits who would not have been out of place in New York City walked the streets. She noticed very few women, and those who were about kept their heads down and went about their business. As the horse trotted toward the center of the town, she glanced from side to side at the various buildings. First, rough houses, almost as if they had been thrown up overnight, but as they traveled further, the quality got better. Then the houses turned into shops and businesses. A blacksmith, a tailor, a seamstress, a bank, the jailhouse, everything you might expect from a bustling and growing town. When they reached the square towards the center, Jack halted the horse and dismounted. He tied the reins securely and then helped Eve down. "Welcome to Helena," Jack said. The way he said it suggested that he wasn't proud of the place. Eve thought that it simply served a function for Jack, nothing more. "Thank you," Eve replied, brushing down her skirts. "My pleasure." "So what happens now?" she asked. "I guess we have to find your husband-to-be somehow. Let me ask around and figure out the best way to contact him." "Thank you," Eve said again, though she couldn't help but sense the reluctance in his voice, almost as if he didn't want to. "You stay right next to the horse. Do not move. If anyone asks, tell them you're with me. Just a warning, the men around here probably aren't used to seeing many beautiful women like you. If the worst happens, I won't be far. Just shout." Her eyes grew wide with horror, flashing back to the bandits and the horrific tales Jack had told her about what might happen if they got their hands on her. Jack saw her reaction and smiled. "Don't worry, you'll be fine. I'm not going far." He stood for a moment, considering his options, glancing around the square. Finally, he sighed with resultant acceptance. "I'm going to the lawyer's office over there. Won't be long." She watched him stride off toward the far corner. Disappearing into the offices of the lawyer, the signage told her it was a L.B. Slot and Son. Hissed. He'd been gone about 5 minutes when she saw the door open and Jack step out. Even from this distance, she could tell he wasn't his usual composed self. He marched back in her direction. As he drew closer, she noticed his face was flushed, almost as if he'd been arguing. Then a man in a dark blue suit and tie appeared in the open doorway behind him. He had a bush of white hair on top of his head, and so she guessed him to be Mr. L.B. Slot himself and not his son. The lawyer had a sheaf of papers in his hands which he waved in the air. "You'll sign them soon enough, let me assure you," the man called out. Jack stopped and turned. "Never. I swear I would be dead before I signed them." He turned back, marching toward Eve, his face as black as night. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice full of concern. He gave her a soft smile. "Just the usual. Like I said, I've been having a lot of trouble recently. Somebody's trying to push me off my land, break my business, and force me to sell cheap. Those are the papers for the deal. It's not going to happen. It's my daddy's cabin. It's my daddy's land. I'm not selling. I'm not going anywhere. No matter what they do to me, I'll fight to the end." Eve reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're right. That's a terrible thing to happen. You fight for your land, Jack." She offered him a sympathetic smile. She hesitated for a moment, biting her bottom lip, and then said, "You know, Arthur is a successful businessman. I would hazard a guess. He knows people. I have an idea." She paused again, as if unsure if she should share her thoughts. "I don't think you should spend Christmas alone. I'd like to thank you for what you've done for me. Why don't I talk to him? You could come out and join us at Arthur's ranch for the day. I'd love to have you there to enjoy the festivities. Maybe then you could talk to Arthur and see if he can help you." Jack leaned his head back and laughed. Eve, how I wish things could be different. You're such a kind, caring, sweet person. Eve furrowed her brow, confused. Why had the man just laughed? Is that a yes? Jack shook his head. No, it's not. I'm sorry. Why not? I'm sure Arthur will be welcoming. Oh, Eve, that man doesn't deserve you. That man? If you mean Arthur, what do you mean he doesn't deserve me? She demanded, bristling with indignation. Jack glanced back and forth between the papers in the lawyer's hand and the saloon door. He seemed to wrestle with whether to continue. Finally, he turned back to her, locking eyes, and said, It's Arthur Hardwick who's behind all my troubles. It's him. Arthur Hardwick's the one who wants me off my land. Chapter 13. No, that's not true, Eve said after almost 10 seconds of simply staring at Jack. Mr. Slot had followed Jack and now caught up with him. But as opposed to continuing their altercation, he simply glared at Jack and marched off in the direction of the saloon. Jack gave her a sad smile. I'm sorry. I wasn't going to say anything. After all, none of this is your fault. No, I don't believe you, Jack. You must have made a mistake. She froze, her breath catching. This can't be right. Arthur is a good, honest man. Jack gave a reluctant chuckle. I'm afraid he's anything but an honest man. I don't know what he's told you in his letters, but that man is behind every shady business practice in this town and far beyond. He showed up out of nowhere and started taking over. He's got the lawyer in his pocket and probably the sheriff, too. No, Jack, this is all a complete misunderstanding. I'm sure we can sort it out. She glanced toward the saloon as two men emerged. One was the lawyer, Mr. Slot, who pointed in their direction. The other was a middle-aged man, about 40, she guessed. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and was broad rather than tall, his girth commanding attention. As he drew closer, she noticed that he was unshaven. His suit was creased, and there was a suspicious stain on his tie that looked a lot like egg. I'm not staying. I'll leave you here. You know where the cabin is if you need help? Jack asked, glancing toward the approaching men. He went to his horse and mounted in one swift, easy moment. What do you mean? Help, Jack? She asked, full of concern. But before he could answer, they were interrupted. Is it true? The man with the egg-stained tie called out, smiling broadly as he neared. Is that you, Eve? She looked at him, confused for a split second. How could this man know her name? Even before he said the next words, the realization hit her. It's me, Arthur Hardwick. We're to be married. She gasped, stunned. She stared at him for a moment, realizing he was nothing like his description in his letters. Perhaps he had been handsome in his youth, but now he was a large man, and he smelled faintly of whiskey. The reality of the situation began to set in. How did you end up with this man? Arthur asked, pointing at Jack. Has he touched you? She gasped in shock. Absolutely not. Jack has been nothing but a gentleman. He rescued me from the train when the bandits attacked. He feared something terrible might happen to me. The bandits that attacked the train? Arthur said, his tone oddly flat. I didn't realize. There was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't referring to Jack's actions. You might have made a mistake there, Hardwick. You're paid bandits attacking the train, transporting your own fiancée. She's a good woman. Be sure you look after her, Jack said. My bandits, Arthur roared with laughter. How dare you? You repeat that and I'll have you in court for slander. Arthur, please. Jack helped me. He risked his life. Eve reached out and softly touched Arthur's shoulder. He glanced down at it and his body seemed to relax. Jack just glared at Arthur. See what I mean? She deserves looking after, Hardwick. I'm not going to be lectured by the likes of you, Arthur shot back, his face tightening. Jack says you're trying to take his land. Is that true? She asked Arthur. Is that what he said? Arthur sneered. I wouldn't believe everything that comes out of his mouth. I'm offering to purchase his land. I'm expanding my ranch properties. Nothing more, nothing less. He can take the offer or leave it. And you're not behind the rustlers or the thefts? Jack pressed. Of course, I'm not, Arthur snapped. How dare you accuse me of such things in front of my future wife? What's next? Blaming me for the summer drought? He rolled his eyes and turned toward her as if Jack were speaking nonsense. I do thank you, though, for looking after her and bringing her safely to me. You don't deserve her. Everything I've said is true, Ev. Don't take me to be a liar, Jack said, his voice heavy with resignation. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but this man is not what he pretends to be. Jack took one last lingering look at Eve before turning and riding away. She watched him go, unease washing over her and leaving her feeling vulnerable. "You didn't tell me you were coming," Arthur said, smiling. "But look at you. You're absolutely delightful. The photographer in New York, you know. I don't think he did you justice, my dear. You just radiate beauty." "Thank you, Arthur," she said somewhat reluctantly, her eyes flicking back to where Jack had disappeared. "Don't listen to a word that man says," Arthur continued. "I had a small dispute with his father when I first arrived out here, and he's held a grudge against me ever since. This is my lawyer, Mr. Slot. He'll vouch for what an upstanding gentleman I am." "Oh, yes, miss," Mr. Slot said in a smooth tone. "Mr. Hardwick here is the most reputable businessman in the entire town. Folks come from far and wide to do business with him. You've found yourself a very fine husband, if I may say so, dear." There was something about Mr. Slot's voice that sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't like him, not one bit. She decided she would ignore the lawyer and turned her attention to Arthur. "Do you drink at the saloon often?" she asked, remembering Robert Mortimer's words about the evils that took place there. "I own part of the establishment, my dear. I sometimes visit to ensure we're providing excellent customer service. You understand these things, don't you?" She nodded as if she did, but the truth was she didn't. His exaggerations about his appearance already concerned her. What else might he have lied about? Could Jack's accusations have been true? "I'm so glad you're here," Arthur said. "I've waited so long for you. I've already spoken with the pastor about the situation. He said we could marry as soon as you arrived. All it would take is half an hour's notice, so long as it's not Sunday, of course. I suggest we marry immediately and head to the ranch. I wouldn't want you to stay under my roof as an unmarried woman." "No, no, Arthur, of course not. I am agreeable to a wedding," she replied, though her gaze drifted again to where Jack had left. "Excellent," Arthur said, rubbing his hands together. "Mr. Slot, would you go and tell the pastor Eve is here? You will be my witness at the wedding, of course?" "Indeed, indeed," Slot replied and then bustled off. She didn't know what to do. Arthur wasn't what she'd expected, but she reminded herself that appearances weren't everything. He'd been polite and straightforward so far. Perhaps Jack's accusations were just fantasy. Men often held grudges. They could see things that simply were not the case when they had misfortune. What better way to wound a rival than to convince his fiancée that he was unworthy? But she'd spent days with Jack. Was that really the kind of man he was? She didn't think it was. But what choice did she have? Arthur was here. He had arranged a wedding. And he was certainly right about one thing. Considering the fact that she was here to marry him, it would not be right to go to his ranch and spend the night there as an unmarried woman. Despite her disappointment in his appearance, he indeed seemed to be a successful businessman. He was about the age he said in his letter. And now he was smiling at her with loving affection. It was strange, but she thought she had seen that type of smile before somewhere. She just couldn't remember where. Chapter 14. Eve looked in the mirror and took 2 deep breaths. An hour had passed since Jack had ridden away and she'd been introduced to Arthur. Everything had happened in such a whirlwind that the confusion still blurred her judgment. Now, in just a matter of moments, she was going to walk into the church and be married. Mr. Slot had returned in record time, saying the pastor would be ready within the hour. Arthur had made some grumbling noises about being promised a half-hour wait, but decided against pressing the matter further. Eve had mentioned wanting to make some changes to her appearance before the wedding. Arthur had expressed a desire to change his clothes as well. He disappeared in the direction of the saloon, which she found somewhat strange, considering he was supposedly there to check out the establishment's customer service. The fact that he had clothing there suggested he might have a room, but in her confusion, she decided to keep silent. She'd gone with Mr. Slot, who offered her the use of his facilities to freshen up. She had no fine dress to change into, and indeed the one she was wearing needed laundering. But it was the best of a poor selection, so she brushed it down, wiped away a few of the more prominent stains, combed her hair, washed her face, and decided she was ready to be married. She knew that once she got to Arthur's ranch, everything would be different. No doubt he would buy her new clothes, and the ranch would be well equipped. But still, a nagging feeling tugged at her. Could Jack have been truthful in all he'd said? Was Arthur really a successful businessman, or was he truly involved in shady dealings? And what about that strange comment Jack had made about it being his bandits that had attacked the train? There was no time for such questions. Eve knew perfectly well that she couldn't voice her doubts. It simply wouldn't be right for a soon-to-be wife to do so. Even if she had the courage to speak up, she was certain Arthur wouldn't like the questions. She knew she had to trust the process. Arthur's letters had been good, and despite the minor issue of his appearance, Arthur seemed genuine. He had certainly been welcoming. Mr. Slot had said he'd knock for her when they were ready at the church. While she sat waiting for that knock, she couldn't help but wonder if Jack was now approaching his cabin. She'd found it a delightful place. Yes, it lacked a woman's touch, but that could easily be solved. She hoped Arthur's ranch would be similar, but something told her it wouldn't. She guessed it would be a sprawling place, designed to show off Arthur's status and prestige in the area. She feared it wouldn't have the charm of Jack's little cabin. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "They're ready for you, miss," Slot's voice came from outside. She opened the door, and Slot looked her up and down, just as so many men had done before. The scrutiny gave her a shiver. "Oh yes, Mr. Hardwick will be most pleased," he said. Eve said nothing, simply nodding her head. He waved her through the door and into the square. They walked across to the far side, where the white church stood proud in the corner. Standing before the entrance to the churchyard, Eve paused for a few moments. A nagging feeling twisted in her stomach, warning her she might be making a grave mistake. "Come on, dear. There's no time to lose," Slot said, gesturing her forward. She walked the 20 yards to the church door. Slot threw the doors open, revealing the handful of people inside. Arthur stood at the front, now dressed in a finely pressed suit with a freshly cleaned tie. He'd even taken the time to shave. He smiled warmly at her as she walked down the aisle toward him. She couldn't fault him for not looking his best when she'd arrived unannounced, but now he looked considerably better. The pastor, an elderly gentleman with a slight hunch to his shoulders, smiled at the bride and began conducting the service. Eve didn't listen to the pastor's words. Instead, her thoughts began to drift, floating back to Jack in the cabin. She had no idea why. Then she realized she hadn't asked about the fate of the Mortimers and felt guilty about that. Then her mind came back to the present, and she looked at Arthur. He looked back at her and held her gaze. Eve realized that there were no strange feelings in her stomach when Arthur looked at her, and a wave of sadness suddenly engulfed her. Arthur smiled and broke her gaze. He looked her up and down in just the way Slot had done a few moments earlier. His smile widened still, and it was at that moment that Eve knew where she had seen such a smile before. It was the same smile that Crispian Black wore when he looked at her. A sense of dread washed over her. Her head spun. But then a sudden commotion at the back of the church pulled her back from the verge of passing out. The doors crashed open, and a familiar voice from behind declared, "This wedding must cease immediately." For the briefest of moments, she thought it was Jack returning to claim her and take her home to his cabin. But when she turned, she saw it wasn't him. Instead, it was a man she believed she'd never seen before in her life. Yet there was something familiar about him. He walked up the aisle, a gun in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. She stepped back, fearful of the man with the gun. "I'm here to claim a man known as Arthur Hardwick," the man announced. As he drew closer up the aisle, she suddenly gasped. She realized who he was. It was Robert Mortimer. His white beard was completely shaved off, and he was dressed like a cowboy rather than the gentleman in a suit she remembered from the train. And now she saw he wasn't an old man at all. He was far closer in age to Katie, his wife. "I'm so sorry, my dear," Robert said as he approached, his gun trained on Arthur at all times. "I'm afraid this man is not who he claims to be." "What on earth is this? This is outrageous," Arthur protested. I am a fine, upstanding gentleman. More commotion stirred at the back of the church. Eve looked to the back where Katie was practically dragging someone into the building. It was the sheriff. What is the meaning of all this, madam? The sheriff demanded of Katie. Is that the sheriff? Robert asked, without turning around, his gun still fixed on Arthur. It is, Katie replied. My name is Robert Mortimer. I am what you might call a bounty hunter, Robert announced. There was a collective gasp from the small gathering in the church. I have in my hand a warrant issued by Judge Bernard Paul for the arrest of a man known as Stuart Settle. And what on earth does that have to do with Mr. Hardwick here? The sheriff said, asking the question everyone in the church wanted to ask. Well, Sheriff, Arthur Hardwick and Stuart Settle are one and the same. Hardwick is just an alias he uses. I would wager he arrived in this town no more than 5 years ago. Silence fell over the church for a moment before the sheriff said, Yes, I would guess that's about right. That's because he was committing crimes across the breadth of Missouri. This man is to be put into my custody, Robert said firmly. Ludicrous, Arthur protested, but he was not so forceful in his denial. You move, I'll shoot you. I get paid all the same. Robert said softly to Arthur Hardwick. Katie, will you come and look after Eve, my dear? Robert asked, gesturing toward the bride. Of course, Katie said, leaving the sheriff's side and walking up the aisle. Sheriff, I will need to use your jailhouse, Robert continued. The sheriff hesitated, knowing how powerful Hardwick was in the area. If you need confirmation, please feel free to telegram the judge. Ask about me as well. I am rather successful in this business, Robert added. The sheriff considered for a moment, then decided he didn't want trouble with a bounty hunter who seemed to know exactly who Hardwick was. That won't be necessary. Bring him this way. For the briefest of seconds, Eve looked at Arthur, and he looked back at her. The lecherous smile was gone from his face entirely. Instead, the man looked deflated and defeated. For a fleeting moment, she thought Arthur might run, but instead, he marched out in front of Robert, the gun pressed into the small of his back. She watched him walk away, and she knew Jack had been right about everything. She stood frozen, taking it all in. Finally, the immense emotions of the situation overwhelmed her, and she slumped onto the steps next to the pastor. Katie crouched down beside her and put an arm around her shoulders. Don't worry, my dear. It will all be all right. Chapter 15. The next morning, Eve woke as soft light flooded in through the curtains. She was staying in a quality inn on the edge of the town, all paid for by the Mortimers. Eve had protested, but Robert Mortimer insisted. He said that his business in Helena was now concluded. By the time he returned to St. Paul, he would be well paid. Apparently, there was a bounty of $450 for Arthur Hardwick or Stuart Settle, or whatever his actual name might be. Robert had said that Arthur probably had another name prior to Stuart Settle. Robert interrupted Eve's protests, saying it would be a disgrace if he failed to pay for Eve's accommodation, considering the circumstances. With no money to her name other than a few dollars, Eve decided she had no option, so she agreed. That evening, the Mortimers explained over dinner that Robert had been a bounty hunter for some 20 years. He was assisted by his wife. They often traveled for assignments posing as a married couple. Bounty hunters were usually loners, which attracted attention. However, no one looked twice at a couple, especially a seemingly old man with a long white beard. This was Robert's favorite disguise when traveling, though it had eventually become too itchy, prompting him to shave it off. They also described how they had escaped from the bandits. Rather than confront them, Robert had leaned into the appearance of being an unassuming old gentleman. Their bags had been stashed in the train compartment, and he carried nothing of value on him personally. The bandits brushed him and Katie aside, heading straight for the rich pickings in the guard's compartment. After the robbery, once the bandits had ridden away, the younger men had cleared the track after several hours, and the train finally made it to Helena. Other than one young man with a gunshot wound to his shoulder, no one had been hurt. Robert must have apologized at least 50 times for robbing Eve of her supposed husband-to-be and the promise of a good life. Finally, Eve confessed all that Jack had told her. I would suggest that what Jack says is true, my dear, Robert said. I won't bore you with the list of crimes he committed in Missouri. They're too numerous for tonight. I'd much rather fancy eating some dessert." Eve smiled slightly, seeming to recover from the shock of the day's events. It appeared that she had had a lucky escape. She couldn't get that horrible smile from Arthur at the altar out of her mind. They continued talking into the small hours. Eve spoke about being rescued by Jack and how she had spent the last few days in the cabin. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, they headed to their rooms. Eve had gently awoken to soft light coming through the curtains. After lying somewhere between sleep and consciousness for a few minutes, there was a gentle knock on the door, and Eve rose to her feet. "Who is it?" "It's just me, Katie," a female voice said. Eve went to open the door. "Good morning. Did you sleep?" Katie asked. "Better than I thought I would," Eve laughed. "Would you like to join me for breakfast downstairs? Shall we say in 15 minutes?" Katie asked. "Yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you," Eve replied. Katie nodded her head and left Eve to get dressed. 15 minutes later, Eve was downstairs, sitting opposite Katie, who seemed to have ordered half the menu for the pair of them. "Where's Robert?" Eve asked. Katie looked a little sheepish. "He had some business to take care of, something related to the matters from yesterday. He left just after dawn." Eve nodded, and suddenly the reality of the situation hit home once again. What on earth was she going to do now? Here she was, out west, with no money and no husband to marry. "When will you be heading back to New York?" Eve asked after the food arrived, and they began to tuck in. "Not until after Christmas now. Although we didn't mention the nature of Robert's business, my brother does indeed live out here. But he doesn't have room for us to stay with him. We'll visit him over the festive season and then take the first train back to New York after Christmas. I suppose that's one of the arrangements Robert is making as we speak, arranging for the marshal to meet us at some point." Eve nodded her head and then was silent for a moment, imagining Arthur in a jail cell. "I can't believe I was taken in the way I was. I'm a fool to head out here on nothing more than a string of promises. Don't take it so personally. It seems that this man Arthur, or whatever his real name is, has made a habit of this sort of thing all his life. He's a confidence trickster. The sheriff has had great concerns about him for months now. The trouble is, they can't pin anything on him out here. Sure, there's great suspicion that he's behind the bandits who hit the train, the cattle rustlers who raided your Jack's land, and a whole host of other strange calamities. But there's no solid evidence. Back in Missouri, though, there's plenty of proof, which is why he must be taken back and face justice there." "What will happen to his business interests here?" Eve asked. Katie shrugged. "That remains to be seen." "I don't know what I'm going to do now, Katie," Eve admitted. "You'll have time to decide. Who knows? In my experience, in situations like this, solutions just seem to turn up." It was at that moment that Robert entered the inn. He stood in the doorway and removed his hat. He saw Katie and Eve at the nearby table. "Ah, breakfast. An excellent idea. Good morning, Eve. Did you sleep well?" "I did, thank you, Robert. It was an excellent bed. Not too hard and not too soft. You are most kind to pay for this." Robert raised a hand to stop Eve's thanks. "Please, Eve, I have said before, it is the least I can do." Katie cocked her head and looked expectantly at her husband. She didn't say a word, but he seemed to understand her meaning. He nodded back in return. Katie turned to Eve. "Eve, if you don't mind, would you excuse me and Robert? There's a small matter we need to attend to. Finish breakfast. It's charged to our account, remember. If you want anything else, please order it. I should be back here around noon. I think we will take some air then. Have a walk around the town. Come on, Robert, we've got to go." "Yes, yes, of course," Robert blustered, seemingly a little put out by his wife's sudden urgency to leave. He took one last, lingering glance at the table full of food and followed Katie out the doorway. Eve didn't even have time to respond. She heard some murmuring in the corridor, indicating that Katie was speaking to somebody. Then, a few seconds later, the door opened again, and a tall, broad, familiar figure entered. He flashed his famous smile in Eve's direction. It was Jack. Eve almost fell off her chair in shock. Chapter 16. "Jack, what are you doing here?" Eva asked, rising to her feet. He walked over to the table. the smile still broad on his face. "Sit down, Eve," he insisted, seeing the other patrons in the inn taking an interest in their business. She did as he requested, suddenly wishing she had taken more time to fix her appearance that morning. She nervously flicked a stray strand or two of hair behind her ear. "Can I join you?" he asked, his tone as courteous as ever. Eva quickly recovered her composure. "Of course. Sorry, would you like some coffee?" "Yes, that would be wonderful, thank you," Jack said as he sat down and placed his hat on the chair next to him. She poured from the pot into a clean cup already set on the table. "I don't understand. Why are you here?" Eva asked, pushing the cup in his direction. Jack took a long drink before replying. "I needed that. Your friend, Robert Mortimer, came to see me this morning. He explained what happened yesterday. I'm so sorry about how it all turned out for you." Now it all made sense. Robert being missing that morning for some mysterious business he had to tie up, Katie acting so strangely. Eva suddenly understood the shared glances between the married couple and Katie's reasons for making a swift and subtle exit. Katie had wanted to give her and Jack time alone. Eva also realized that last night she had spoken a lot about Jack, the rescue, and the cabin where he lived. Katie had obviously put two and two together and decided, quite blatantly, to play matchmaker. She had sent her husband to tell Jack what had happened and to bring him here while she kept Eva entertained. Suddenly, Eva felt a nervous tingling in the pit of her stomach. "Robert, that man never ceases to surprise me. It was a bit of good fortune that I chose to ride in their compartment on the train from St. Paul," Eve said with a laugh. "And as for being sorry? No, Jack, you have nothing to be sorry for. It's me who needs to apologize." "What do you need to apologize for?" "You're the one who has been deceived and betrayed," Jack replied. Eva sighed, knowing that it was true. Once more, she felt a pang of regret, not so much at having been deceived, but at allowing it to happen so easily. In her desperation to escape New York, she had failed to consider the potential pitfalls of fleeing out west. "I need to apologize for not believing what you told me yesterday about Arthur," she admitted. She was not yet used to the fact that Arthur wasn't his real name. But then again, no one seemed to be sure that Stuart was his real name either. "It's hardly surprising, is it? I should have mentioned it earlier. As soon as you told me who you were going to marry, I should have raised my concerns." Eva considered this for a moment. "Would I have believed you if you'd said it then? I doubt it. What I said yesterday was true, though. The man didn't deserve you." "Well, going by what the Mortimers say, I don't think he'll be marrying anyone or deceiving anyone anytime soon. Do you want to tell me your story about what he's done to you? You spoke of cattle rustling and offers for your land?" Jack shook his head. "I don't think so. That's in the past now. He's gone, along with his influence and his money. I want to draw a line under it so I can finally focus on building the ranch over the next year." "Jack, I know you can realize your daddy's dream," Eva said, smiling again. Their eyes locked. "Yes, I believe I can," Jack said, "under the right circumstances." He paused, suddenly looking decidedly nervous. "What is it? What's wrong?" Eva asked. He rubbed his chin as if wondering how to phrase his answer. "Yes, as I said, I believe I can achieve Daddy's dream of having the biggest ranch in Montana. But that's not all I want. Prosody 7%. What's the point of doing that alone? I have my own hopes and dreams as well." He stopped speaking for a moment and pictured it all in his mind first. "My cabin out there is lonely. It's not built for just one. It's built for two, and God willing to raise children. I want a family. I want a child of my own who will call me Daddy." Something in Eva stirred, and a tingling sensation swept over her. She realized that was what she wanted too. Jack's dreams were her dreams. She'd realized it before, when she'd ridden away from Jack's cabin to come to Helena. That was why leaving the cabin had made her so sad. Despite its simple appearance, it seemed to have a magical quality. She knew she could make it a real and true home. "You deserve it," she said, not knowing what else to say. "And I want those Christmases I used to enjoy as a child," Jack continued. "You know, the kind we talked about?" Eva nodded and smiled, her thoughts drifting back to her own Christmases as a child, waking up to a stocking full of candy at the end of her bed, presents under the tree, the aroma of turkey cooking on the stove, and the joy and kindness in her parents' adoring eyes. Yes, the magical Christmases of years gone by, she said softly. Jack, you deserve everything you want. Jack took a deep breath, pushed his coffee cup aside, and leaned forward on the table. He lowered his voice, causing Eve to lean forward to hear him. But all of that will mean nothing without the right woman to share it with. Until recently, there had never been anyone. And then, a few days ago, something magical happened. In a strange, short way, of course. Bandits stopping a train, and somehow I managed to rescue an angel. I think it must have been my own kind of Christmas miracle. Eva gasped, suddenly realizing what he was saying. You mean, you want me to? Yes, Jack interrupted. I want you to marry me. I want us to build a life together out there in the cabin. I know it wasn't what you were expecting. You thought you were coming here to marry a rich, successful man with land, power, and influence. That was taken from you, I know. But I'm here. I'm just a man with a little homestead and an old dream to cling to. I know I can't expect you to share it with me, but a man has nothing if he can't hope. Eva was silent for a moment as everything fell into place. She knew in her heart that Jack was the man she was meant to marry, not Arthur. God had shown her the way, no matter how strange the circumstances. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes, Jack, I'll marry you. I want nothing more in the world. Chapter 17. It was Christmas Eve, and once again Eve stood at the doorway to the church in Helena. This time she had Robert Mortimer on her arm. She had requested that he give her away. She was dressed in a beautiful but practical new blue dress. Katie and Robert had returned to the inn a few days ago to discover that Katie's matchmaking plans had worked perfectly. Katie was almost giddy with excitement. Jack had hurried to find the pastor to arrange the service. With Christmas approaching, he thought it seemed sensible to wait a few days until Christmas Eve. That way, Eve and Jack could return to the cabin as man and wife to spend their first Christmas together. Besides, Jack had a few plans for the cabin that would take a few days to organize. Eve was thrilled with the date he had selected. Robert and Katie insisted that Eve stay with them at the inn at their expense until the wedding. Katie also insisted they go shopping. Eve protested extensively, saying their kindness was simply too much, but both Robert and Katie shook their heads firmly. Remember, if it wasn't for you, we might not have been able to catch that criminal, Robert said. Eve and Katie visited one of the two seamstresses in the city. Katie explained the situation, emphasizing that the wedding was literally just hours away. The seamstress worked late into the night to make Eve a dress. Not only did Katie insist on purchasing a dress for the wedding, but also 2 good practical sets of work clothes. Despite Eve's protests about the expense, Katie was unwavering. Those items wouldn't be ready until Christmas Eve, but the seamstress promised faithfully that they could be collected after the wedding, before Eve headed back to the cabin. Everything was set. The night before the wedding, Eve went to bed and said her prayers. She thanked God for Jack and the Mortimers. She prayed that tomorrow her parents would be watching down on her as he married and set out on her new life. "Are you ready, my dear?" Robert asked Eve as she glanced up at the sky. "Yes," she said, turning to Robert. "I am." Robert pushed open the doors to the church to reveal the interior bathed in glorious winter light. Just a few witnesses were present. Katie, the sheriff, the seamstress who had already informed Katie that the garments were ready, the owner of the inn where they were staying, and a handful of Jack's acquaintances. Eve walked proudly up the aisle toward Jack. He was dressed in his best attire, his Sunday best, as he called it, and he looked more handsome than ever. The service passed by in a blur as the couple exchanged their vows. When it came time for Jack to give Eve the ring, she held out her hand, and he slipped a simple wedding band onto her long, elegant finger. "It was my mama's," he whispered softly. She smiled, touched that Jack cared enough to give her something so precious. When the service was concluded, everyone gathered outside in the churchyard to offer their congratulations. The seamstress ran back to her shop and returned with the packet of clothing. Then it was time to head back to the cabin. Eve said farewell to Robert and Katie, who promised to visit the cabin before leaving Helena. They also assured her they would return in a year to see Katie's brother. Still, there were tears in her eyes as they departed. She couldn't thank them enough for all they had done for her. Jack helped her up into the saddle. They began the slow ride back to the cabin. There was still a significant amount of snow on the ground, but the passage was less arduous than it had been on the journey from the cabin to Helena. The horse made the trip back in half the time. Eve's heart sang as the cabin came into view on the horizon. She couldn't believe how she had come to miss the place. Jack brought the horse to a stop by the porch stairs. He whispered to her, "Welcome home." He dismounted effortlessly, then turned and lifted her down, his strong hands clasping firmly around her waist. The familiar flutter of butterflies stirred in her stomach. Jack gestured for her to go inside. Clasping her green carpet bag, which contained all her possessions and the new garments from the seamstress, she smiled at him and opened the door. She stopped in her tracks, gasping in surprise. In the corner by the fireplace stood a magnificent Christmas tree. Jack had taken the time to decorate it with strings of cranberries, fruits, pine cones, and amazing paper decorations. On the table was more greenery, and mistletoe hung from the ceiling. Jack came up behind her as they stood beneath the mistletoe. "Welcome home, my wife," he murmured. "This is now truly a cabin built for two." He stopped, held her close, and kissed her gently on the lips. She wanted the moment to last forever. It felt so magical. They lingered in each other's arms for a few moments longer, then Jack pulled away. One last decoration. He went to the kitchen and returned very quickly with a wreath made of holly. For the door. "It's beautiful," she said. Jack opened the door and told Eve to hang it on the nail he had already hammered in for that purpose. She did so, and when she took a step back to admire it, the cabin truly felt like home. Later that day, when Jack was out seeing to the chickens, she was unpacking her green carpet bag in the bedroom that she and Jack would now share. The rest of the cabin could use a few feminine touches, but she knew she would see to that in due course. There was no rush. Now was the time to enjoy her new home and really get to know her new husband. And of course, there was Christmas to enjoy. She pulled out her belongings, merged as they were, and stashed them away. Then at the bottom of the bag, she found something else. She looked into the bag and smiled as she reached down and pulled out a doll. It was Rachel, the flaming red hair now a little faded. Throughout her life, through all the hardships she had faced, that special gift from her parents at Christmas time had stayed by her side. Rachel had traveled with her all the way from New York to Montana, and here, in this wonderful cabin, she would remain forever. Thus, Epilogue, 5 years later. "We really must get a cook. It'll save you all the work," Jack said. "Don't you dare. There'll be nobody else cooking in this cabin, I can assure you. Except maybe her," Eve replied, turning to reveal a large, swollen belly. Their second child would be due in just over 2 months. Jack was holding a little girl in his arms. She was named Victoria, after Jack's mother. Victoria had just celebrated her 3rd birthday. Just like her mother, she had bright red hair that now hung down to her waist. In fact, she was a little version of her mother, almost identical in every way. "Would you like that, little one?" Jack asked his daughter. "Would you like to cook just like Mama?" "Yes," her little voice chirped. "Well, maybe next year you can help," Eve said with a smile. "After all, I'll have a baby to look after by next Christmas." "Will Santa Claus really find us out here?" Victoria asked the question that had been worrying her for the past few days. "Of course. Santa Claus always makes this cabin one of the first places he visits in Montana, you know," Jack said, a serious expression on his face. Eve couldn't help but smile. Victoria always took her father at his word, and Jack, true to his nature, couldn't resist teasing their little girl from time to time. "Now we know that Santa Claus knows the way to our cabin. Get out of the kitchen, and I'll dish up this dinner," Eve said, shooing them both away. The family dined together on the finest beef from their own herd. Jack had worked hard over the past 5 years, and the homestead could now truly be called a ranch. They employed ranch hands who slept in the new bunkhouse behind the stables. The land attached to the cabin had expanded greatly. After the arrest and conviction of Arthur Hardwick, his lands had lain fallow for 2 years. A great thunderstorm and lightning strike had resulted in the enormous ranch house and stables burning down. No one seemed willing to take it on until Jack stepped forward. The mayor of the nearby town was only too glad to give his approval. The paperwork was signed, and Jack suddenly became the owner of the land. It wasn't quite the biggest ranch in Montana yet, but it was getting there. Jack was determined that one day his father's dream would come true. Later that night, after they had eaten, Jack pulled out a special book. It had been specially purchased in Helena earlier in the year. "It's a special story that I'm going to read to you this Christmas Eve, Victoria," he said. "This is a story Mama's own papa told her one Christmas. It's A Christmas Carol by Mr. Charles Dickens from England." Jack read from the book, and Victoria sat, listening intently. Eve watched and was almost transported back in time. She found it remarkable how Jack could deliver the voices just like her own father used to do all those years ago. She knew perfectly well her father would have been proud of the choices she had made in marrying Jack. And just like all those years ago, as the story ended, a little child fell asleep. This time, it was Eve's daughter. Jack carried her carefully to bed, tucking her in and making sure she was comfortable. In the morning, Jack and Eve were awoken by excited squeals. They smiled at each other, wished each other a happy Christmas, and went to see their daughter. "Look, Santa Claus has come," Victoria exclaimed, sitting up in bed. At the foot of it was a stocking filled with oranges from California, nuts, and candy purchased earlier that month in Helena. "Don't eat all that at once," Eve said with a smile. "You don't want to make yourself sick." Then she chuckled to herself, realizing she sounded just like her own mama. "I think Santa Claus may have brought other gifts as well," Jack said. They made their way into the living area, now freshly painted. A family portrait hung on the wall, and winter greenery adorned the mantelpiece. The dining table and chairs had been replaced with a larger, newer table that even had a tablecloth draped over it. In the corner stood a huge Christmas tree, and underneath it was a range of gifts. Although Jack and Eve were now considered prosperous, they had decided not to spoil their daughter. Most of the gifts were sensible and practical, but finally, there was one last parcel left. Victoria opened it and squealed in delight, holding the gift close to her chest. "She's beautiful. Does she have a name?" she asked. "Yes, she does," Eve said with contentment in her voice. "She's called Rachel. My mama and papa gave her to me one Christmas, and now I'm giving her to you."